steel, firearms, and the industrialists crossing into another world. Hey, fanfic family! So glad to see you here again to continue this incredible adventure. As always, kindly remember, this story is 100% fiction. So don't go looking for dimensional portals in your closet. All rights to this fantastic novel belong to the original author. We're just your humble narrators of epic tales. Are you enjoying the fanfic? Show it by subscribing to our YouTube channel and dropping us a like. And if you're impatient for more exclusive content, our Patreon is your happy place. Chapter 751 Hot Air Balloon. The molten iron's intense heat shone on the group, making their faces flush red. Incredible, Mariana exclaimed, covering her red lips in amazement. I never imagined iron smelting could be so magnificent. She couldn't find a more suitable word to describe the scene before her. In her long life, Mariana had seen countless things and considered herself quite knowledgeable. But in her mind, iron smelting was nothing more than this. A blacksmith would build a furnace with mud, no more than half a person's height, put iron ore inside and heat it, then after a certain time, turn on the furnace to let the molten iron flow out, solidify it, and then forge it with a hammer to obtain a small ingot. Compared to what she was seeing, it was like child's play. Catherine also stared wide-eyed, murmuring, how much iron does such an ironworks produce in a year? She meant it as a question, but Paul, eager to show off, certainly wouldn't miss the opportunity. About 2,000 tons, 2,000 tons, Catherine and Marianne's eyes widened simultaneously. Ah, about right. Seeing their expressions, Paul was secretly pleased, but his face remained nonchalant. Paul, you're not bragging, are you? Catherine asked, frowning. As a former general in the Royal Army, she had always been very concerned about the iron production within the royal territory, since the army's weapons, armor, and equipment all relied on iron. Catherine had a rough estimate of how much iron the royal territory could produce each year. 3,000 tons. And now, Paul was telling him that just one ironworks here could produce 2,000 tons of iron annually, 2/3 of the royal territory's total annual output. And from their previous conversation, they knew that he had more than just this one ironworks under his jurisdiction. This wasn't a joke. Haha, anyway, you'll be an artist from now on. If you don't believe me, you can keep an eye on this place every day. The look of surprise on her face was what Paul wanted to see. The corners of his mouth curled up almost imperceptibly. Then, what's your total output? I mean, all the ironworks combined, Mariana asked again, her voice trembling slightly. Let me think, the data the statistics committee gave me last time, it's about 30,000 tons. This was getting more and more outrageous. This figure nearly made Mariana faint. Nathan, seeing the incredible expression on his mother's face, was completely baffled. He didn't usually pay attention to these things, so he had no concept of an annual iron production of 30,000 tons. Taking advantage of Paul and Catherine walking ahead, he tugged at Marianne's sleeve and whispered, What? Is 30,000 tons a lot? More than a lot, Marianne replied, her voice low but her tone sharp. Do you know how much iron Gabella produces each year? How much? You've really wasted all these years. Although there's no accurate statistic, I estimate it's between 3,000 and 5,000 tons. Every time the Empire purchases military equipment, the price of ironware within its borders skyrockets. Nathan stuck out his tongue. Is the difference that big? Actually, having always revered magic and paid little attention to social production, he hadn't realized what this disparity meant. Many people believed that if you lacked something, you could just buy it at the market. As long as you were willing to spend money, countless merchants would rush to meet your needs. Goods seemed like crops growing from the ground, something that already existed in this world. Time passed minute by minute. They toured the entire ironworks in awe and embarked on their journey back to Lacquer town. Catherine, riding her horse, felt a pang of emotion. Perhaps Paul truly was a pacifist. What would other lords do with 30,000 tons of iron every year? Perhaps they would equip their armies with superior weapons and armor, then launch a rebellion, not to mention the powerful firearms and cannons. Thinking of this, she couldn't help but ask, what is all that iron used for every year? Paul shrugged. 30,000 tons of iron wasn't a lot. In the late 18th century, England's annual iron production had reached 200,000 tons, and the technology was similar to that of the ironworks they had just visited. In many fields, like machinery and tool manufacturing, things made of iron are much stronger and more durable than those made of wood. Agricultural implements like plows, sickles, and hoes, as well as everyday ironware like pots, stoves, and hammers, are much cheaper here than elsewhere. Small tools like sickles are just readily available consumables for the farmers here. Building stronger bridges. If you travel around the Northwest Bay, you'll see many iron bridges already. Other construction projects in recent years have also used iron extensively, using iron beams, columns, and frames to enhance the stability and height of buildings, and manufacturing ship skeletons and components greatly improves the strength and durability of ships, which is crucial for merchant ships that need to sail long distances. We also export a lot of ironware, for example, from Cape Bay. Just then, they passed a section of railway track being laid. Paul pointed to the bustling construction site. Wood can't support the heavy carriages. Railway tracks are made of steel. If the railway trial is successful, not technically, I'm very confident in that aspect, and if the benefits the railway brings exceed the investment, I foresee a surge in the demand for steel throughout society. At that moment, both Marianne and Catherine had an idea. Give Paul time to build his army. Perhaps the orcs really weren't a problem for him. What's that? Nathan, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke. He pointed to the sky from his horse, his expression one of astonishment as if he had seen something incredible. Marianne and Catherine looked in the direction he was pointing, and their pupils dilated the next second. A huge, colorful sphere, or more precisely, a teardrop-shaped object, thicker at the top and tapering at the bottom, was slowly drifting across the sky. The workers laying railway tracks nearby also saw it, stopping their work and pointing at the unidentified object in the sky, discussing it animatedly. The object drew closer, sunlight filtering through its surface, casting dappled patterns of light and shadow, the surrounding clouds seemingly making way for it, like a star fallen from a dream. Those with keen eyesight gradually discerned that a delicate basket hung below it, and a figure could be vaguely seen moving about on it. This was man-made. Everyone held their breath, a profound sense of awe and curiosity welling up within them. They couldn't tear their gaze away, as if the world had stood still. The mysterious flying object moved leisurely across the azure sky, finally disappearing into the distance. Then they heard Paul say, "That's a hot air balloon." It seems the experiment was a success. Chapter 752 Touching the Sky. Since the dawn of intelligence, the human species has harbored a profound yearning for the sky. Throughout history, countless individuals have striven tirelessly to reach that deep, blue expanse. Birds, capable of soaring freely through the sky, have become objects of human aspiration. Legend has it that someone once crafted wings from wax and successfully took to the skies, but tragically, due to excessive sun exposure, the wax wings melted, and the person plummeted into the sea. In reality, however, there is no definitive record of anyone ever truly taking to the skies. That high, blue expanse seems like a forbidden zone, an inaccessible realm for mortals. Because of this, the sky holds unparalleled symbolic significance in human culture. To some, it is the abode of the gods, to others, it is the realm of freedom. Therefore, when a hot air balloon carrying people and capable of flight appears before the world, the awe it evokes is self-evident. That's a hot air balloon. Looks like their experiment was a success. Upon hearing Paul say this, Nathan's body stiffened, and he turned to stare at his brother with a fierce look, as if he wanted to devour Paul. Hot air balloon? What's a hot air balloon? And what experiment are you talking about? Clearly, Paul Gleman knew about that thing in the sky. Seeing this usually silent guy suddenly act like this really startled Paul. He explained, "Well, as you can see, it's that thing in the sky." Marianne asked, "That so-called hot air balloon, you created it?" "Our researchers created it," Paul said. "I know you must be full of curiosity right now. Actually, the principle behind it isn't complicated. Our researchers discovered that when air is heated, it expands in volume and decreases in density. At this time, the surrounding cold air gives it an upward force, which is called buoyancy. Just like water can support wood with a lower density than water, that's also buoyancy." "You mean it's essentially the same as a boat floating on water?" The three of them looked like they understood but not quite. "Exactly," Paul gave them an affirmative answer. "We want to see it," several people requested in unison. "Let's go." Paul turned his horse around and led them in pursuit of the hot air balloon. He wanted to see it himself, but he was also worried about the safety of the experimenters. Along with Paul's guards, the group galloped away for several miles before the hot air balloon finally began to descend slowly, eventually landing on the ground in an open area. The weather was exceptionally clear that day, making the hot air balloon easy to spot, especially near the landing point. Many people were drawn to the unidentified flying object, some even shouting that it was a miracle and mistaking the people in the basket for angels descended from heaven. When Paul and his group arrived, the experimenters, who had just emerged from the basket, were struggling to explain to the onlookers. Seeing the group bearing the Lord's banner, the crowd spontaneously made way. Paul led Catherine and the others closer to the hot air balloon and, seeing that there seemed to be no accident, breathed a sigh of relief. He recognized the head of the experimental team. Aubrey. Thank goodness you're all alright. It's Lord Giles. Aubrey and his two assistants quickly bowed. I'm so sorry, sir, being seen by so many people. It seems we'll have to go public. Paul waved his hand. It's alright. It wasn't a secret project to begin with. This thing was bound to be known sooner or later. He put on a stern face. But I still have to criticize you. This is too risky. Perhaps you should have secured it with a rope and experimented in a controlled environment, instead of letting it drift aimlessly in the wind. Aubrey quickly explained, we did the experiment you mentioned, which is why we wanted to test it further. The experiment verified our previous theory. There are indeed wind layers in different directions at different altitudes. We can use this to adjust our flight direction. Paul gave them a thumbs up. In that case, congratulations. This will be an important step towards the practical application of hot air balloons. While he was talking to the experimental team, Catherine, Marianne, and Nathan, driven by curiosity, circled the hot air balloon again and again, marveling at it. Upon closer inspection, the flying object was much larger than expected, especially the gas bag, which was enormous. It was clearly made of multiple pieces of linen pieced together, covered with a layer of paper, and shaped like an inverted pear, with a Giles family crest painted in vibrant colors. The basket hanging below was woven from rattan, appearing both sturdy and lightweight, and could likely accommodate 4 to 6 passengers. Above the basket was a dark, smoky object. Perhaps it was used to heat the air inside the gas bag? Catherine immediately realized the crucial role of hot air balloons in war. If one ascended into the sky in one, wouldn't the enemy's positions and troop deployments be laid bare? Nathan was already eager to try. Can I try? Paul asked. Aren't you afraid? Please, this is flying into the sky. I want to be the first of our kind to fly, he said impatiently. Paul looked at Aubrey. Is it safe? Mariana stepped forward first. Even if something goes wrong, I have a way to get everyone safely to the ground. You want to go up too, of course. So, Nathan and Mariana replaced Aubrey's 2 assistants. Nathan carefully stepped into the basket of the hot air balloon, his heart pounding and his palms slightly sweaty. Attention everyone, we're about to take off, Aubrey loudly reminded the passengers. With a sound of flames burning, heated air filled the balloon, and soon the basket suddenly trembled slightly. A huge commotion erupted from the surrounding crowd as the hot air balloon slowly rose into the air amidst everyone's attention. The commotion quickly turned into enthusiastic cheers. People were incredibly excited by the living miracle before their eyes. Nathan felt as if his feet had lost weight, and then realized that the earth was gradually moving away, and the houses and trees below had shrunk to tiny models. Higher and higher. Nathan's heart pounded. A gentle breeze brushed his face, carrying a slight coolness, but it couldn't cool the excitement in his heart. He gripped the edge of the basket tightly, his gaze greedily sweeping over the surroundings. An endless horizon unfolded before him, clouds so close they seemed within reach, sunlight bathing the vast fields in a golden glow. The hot air balloon floated steadily in the air, the world so tranquil, broken only by the occasional burst of flame. Nathan took a deep breath, feeling an unprecedented sense of freedom and peace, as if he had become part of the sky. This is true flight, a magnificent experience beyond the mundane. He thought to himself in admiration. Chapter 753. There is a magical spell that can briefly levitate the recipient several meters into the air, hence its name, levitation. However, its power hasn't reached the point of truly freeing one from the earth. It's more like an enhanced version of high jump. The hot air balloon Marianne and Nathan were riding in today had ascended to an estimated height of 700 or 800 meters. They circled the sky, and upon landing, they were still immersed in the excitement of their first time in the air. Looking down at the world from high above, the landscape below was a tapestry of forests, lakes, villages, and towns, a novel experience unlike anything they had ever had before. As they descended from the basket, Marianne praised the balloon, while Nathan, though unable to hide his excitement, fell to growing unease. He had once been proud of magic, because it could accomplish things that mortals could never do, But today's aerial journey had profoundly challenged his long-held beliefs. How do spellcasters understand magic? Throughout history, wizards have summarized certain rules, those obscure musical notes, intricate patterns, or gestures, through which they projected mystical power from the spiritual world into reality. However, these rules cannot be connected to the effects of magic through known logic and reality, or rather, cannot be deduced step by step. It's like the sun rising after a rooster crows. Over time, spellcasters had to face reality. Magic is a mysterious existence unbound by the logic of reality, its origins unfathomable. In the sky, Nathan again listened to Aubrey's explanation of the hot air balloon's principles. He spoke of matter being composed of invisible fundamental particles, of thermal expansion and contraction, and of the buoyancy formula. Nathan understood some of it, and others he didn't, but judging from Aubrey's relaxed and composed gaze, it was clear that this hot air balloon didn't involve any mysterious or unfathomable factors. Its flight principle relied entirely on the laws of nature. Mortals had accomplished what magic could not. If the hot air balloon had been invented by a spellcaster or a group of spellcasters, Nathan might have felt a little better. But this hot air balloon was truly a miracle created entirely by mortal hands and the laws of nature. After Marianne and Nathan's high-altitude trip, Catherine also strongly requested to write it. Seeing how brave a girl could be, Paul, for the sake of his pride, had to go even if he didn't want to. He overcame his fear of heights and stepped onto the railing with somewhat stiff legs. Marianne, for their safety, also requested to go again. She still had doubts about the balloon's reliability. The balloon's third ascent took a while because it needed refueling. Paul had his guards buy some wool from the surrounding villages as fuel, enough to sustain it for another ascent. Once airborne, Catherine stood there stiffly, her hands gripping the ropes tightly, her tightly closed red lips revealing her inner tension. The impact of the high altitude clearly exceeded her pre-trip mental preparation. In her past life, the princess had climbed high mountains before, gazing down from cliffs into abysses. She thought she wasn't afraid of heights, but she overlooked the fact that even on a cliff face, one's feet are still firmly planted, unlike now, where there's nothing to hold on to in any direction. The thought of a thin wooden plank beneath her feet, and hundreds of meters of air below, gripped Catherine's heart with an indescribable fear. Strangely, when a woman becomes timid, especially a beautiful one, the men around her automatically become bolder. Seeing Catherine like this, Paul took a deep breath and pulled her into his arms. His previous discomfort from the fear of heights vanished, replaced by a warm, soft comfort. "Trust our technicians," his relaxed and confident tone reassured Catherine considerably. Although still nervous, she gradually adjusted. Once freed from fear, Catherine's attention turned to the hot air balloon itself. As expected, the view below was unobstructed. Catherine imagined herself on the battlefield, with the enemy's troop deployments and movements completely transparent to her. She might even detect approaching enemy reinforcements before the opposing commander. The research into hot air balloons was of vital importance to the Alder army. Paul's vision for the war against the orcs wasn't limited to Alder. After driving the orcs out of their territory, Alder needed to completely eliminate the threat from the north. The vast grasslands and desolate deserts could become battlegrounds for the Alder army against the orcs. In such open terrain, a high vantage point was invaluable for assessing the battlefield situation. Especially against the fast-moving, unpredictable orc cavalry, hot air balloons, combined with binoculars and flag signals, could provide excellent early warning. The thrilling aerial journey ended, but this was an unexpected interlude. The next day, as planned, Paul invited Catherine and a group of royal generals to visit the cannon foundry. Artist cannon casting technology has just been upgraded, most notably with the introduction of boring technology, or boring machines. On Earth, John Wilkinson invented the boring machine in 1774, originally intended for manufacturing more accurate cannons, but it unexpectedly played a crucial role in steam engine manufacturing. However, in this world, the application of boring machines underwent a reverse process. Inspired by Paul, Burns had been researching steam engines, facing the major challenge of the rough, uneven inner walls of hand-cast cylinders, resulting in excessive gaps between the piston and cylinder, severe steam leakage, and low thermal efficiency. Therefore, he needed a machining tool that could machine the cylinder inner walls to a very smooth and precise finish, significantly reducing steam leakage. After diligent research and extensive experimentation, the boring machine was born in this world. Under Paul's leadership, Arden's various production departments held regular technical exchange meetings, and Burns introduced the boring machine to the heads of other departments. The military industry immediately realized that this tool could revolutionize cannon production. Traditional hand-cast cannons faced similar problems to those Burns encountered while researching cylinders. Rough, uneven inner walls led to significant gas leakage during gunpowder combustion, resulting in low muzzle velocity, short range, and uneven stress within the inner walls, which could easily cause viral explosions. Despite the craftsman's relentless pursuit of perfection under stringent requirements, the precision achievable by hand was ultimately limited. The advent of the boring machine changed this situation. It was quickly introduced into cannon casting, and this became the catalyst for a major upgrade to the entire casting process. Sorry, I went back to my hometown yesterday and had a lot of things to do, so I went to bed early last night, hence this late post. Chapter 754. In the factory, where steam and metal roared, the steel behemoth-like boring machine stood majestically. Workers used chains and pulleys to slowly hoist rough cast iron cannon barrel blanks to the center of the boring machines. With a roar, the water-powered flywheel started up, and the boring bar, like a precise scalpel, pierced the cannon barrel. Sparks, carrying iron filings, sprayed like a golden rain, filling the air with the scorching smell of metal. The workers no longer needed to rely on feel and experience to repeatedly hammer away. The gears and connecting rods of the boring machines advanced with a steady, mechanical pulse, cutting every inch of the cannon barrel's inner wall until it was as smooth as a mirror, with an error margin not exceeding the thickness of a coin. In the misty haze of coolant and steam, the cannon barrels on the assembly line underwent their transformation one by one. The once rough cast iron shells were given standard curvature and caliber, arranged neatly like copies on the inspection table, reflecting the ruthless pursuit of perfect repetition by industrial civilization. Sunlight streamed through the factory's high windows, slanting across rows of black cannon barrels. The cold, straight metal axes seemed to herald the arrival of a new era. The manufacture of war machines had finally leaped from the fingertips of craftsmen into the absolute realm of steel and mathematics. The royal generals from Crystal Radiance watched this scene solemnly. Each wanted to say something, yet nothing came to mind. Before their visit, the image they had envisioned was of skilled master craftsmen leading their apprentices, hammering away with heavy iron hammers, just as blacksmiths on this continent had done for centuries. Although their creations were more ingenious, using rapidly expanding combustion gases to ignite metal projectiles, the method of creating these wondrous contraptions was not significantly different from that of ordinary swords. If the right approach was found, what the artisans of Alda could do, artisans elsewhere could do as well. But the scene before them shattered that image. Yet, each person could intuitively conclude which method was more advanced and which was more primitive. Humans often possess an exceptionally keen intuition for things that are more powerful, advanced, and potent, able to roughly judge their quality based on appearance alone, much like the belief that a more beautiful fighter jet equates to higher combat capability. The visual impact of mass production compared to traditional handicrafts is incomparable. Clearly, Alda's production methods far surpass the prevailing levels elsewhere in this era. Since the victory at the Black Worm's Nest, Stanford began his process of controlling the three northern regions. He first used Gunther's attack on the Black Worm's Nest as a pretext to attack the Blood Bowl tribe, demanding their submission to Marcus Griles as punishment for the attack. Chief Assayer of the Blood Bowl tribe only then learned of his eldest son's foolish actions, and that Gunther was dead. This undoubtedly dealt Assayer a heavy blow. Although he knew Gunther was in the wrong first, he still refused the Black Worm's demands. Stanford showed no mercy to the chieftain, who always addressed him as an old friend in his letters. He immediately assembled an army of over 5,000 men, including both humans and orcs who had surrendered. A fierce battle ensued in the forest near the Blood Bowl tribe's settlement. The primitively equipped orc warriors roared in anger, wielding stone weapons as they surged forth from the gaps in the trees, charging menacingly at the human army. However, the Black Worm's army deployed muskets and cannons, immediately launching a counterattack. Explosions rang out, and thick smoke filled the forest, severely impairing visibility for both sides. The surrendered orc warriors acted as human shields, fighting the Blood Bowl tribe warriors with comparable height and physique. Although they lacked muskets, their weapons, crafted from polished metal, were superior to the Blood Bowl tribe warriors' generally stone-armored weapons. While the surrendered orcs engaged the enemy, the musketeers behind them would seize the opportunity to deliver a fatal blow. Ultimately, the Black Worm's army, with its superior equipment, overwhelmed the enemy. The number of Blood Bowl tribe corpses piled up, and after hours of fierce fighting, the Blood Bowl warriors, realizing victory was hopeless, fled into the depths of the forest. Chieftain Asoi was protected by his still loyal warriors, but it was too late to retreat. Human armies surged in from all sides, surrounding them. The old orc was severely wounded. He knelt hunched over the scorched earth, his cracked armor torn to shreds by lead bullets, his bare chest riddled with gaping holes, and beneath his dark green skin, charred, rotting flesh lay exposed. His broken axe was deeply embedded in the earth, serving as a crutch to support his crippled body, its faded battle markings pulsating with each muscle spasm. His loyal warriors around him were in no better shape than their chieftain. Some were exhausted, others severely wounded, clinging to life by sheer willpower. Hearing the sound of muskets being loaded amidst the smoke, Asoi's cloudy, single eye suddenly flashed with a fierce light. A battle roar, mixed with blood and spittle, erupted from his throat. The warriors around him raised their weapons, determined to fight this hopeless battle to the bitter end. Bang! The volley of musket fire roared, and the last warriors of the Blood Bowl tribe fell one after another. One bullet spun and pierced Asoi's forehead, freezing his final, unfinished roar into an eternal echo in the forest. When the smoke cleared, his riddled body, having lost its last support, collapsed helplessly to the ground. The Black Worm's Nest had won. Emboldened by their great victory, the human army issued an ultimatum to the native tribes that had always harbored hostility towards them: choose peace, the peace under Arden's rule, of course, or be driven to the northern ice plains. The Blood Bowl tribe, the most powerful tribe in the area, was led by Chief Asoi, who had always held immense prestige. Their annihilation left all the hostile native tribes without a banner, allowing the Black Worm's Nest to easily gain control of the northern lands. It was at this time that Arvis and his servant Malek arrived in the northern lands. Exhausted from their long journey, their clothes torn to shreds by the winds of the plains, they each led a similarly emaciated horse into the forest. Perhaps as compensation for their misfortunes, fortune finally smiled upon the two travelers. As their control over the northern lands deepened, Arda's stronghold extended deep into the forest, and they soon encountered a trading post, receiving timely aid. Guided by the staff, they continue their journey towards the Black Worm's Nest. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 755. When Stanford received a report that a high-ranking scholar claiming to be from the Gabella Imperial capital wished to meet him, he was utterly bewildered. Leaving aside the fact that the Gabella Imperial capital was separated from the northern three lands by half a continent, why would a respected scholar come to such a desolate place? Driven by curiosity, he decided to meet the man. If this man was playing a trick on him, he would make him regret it to death. The development of the northern three lands was desperately short of labor. In the reception room, Stanford met two guests. One was around 50 years old, slightly hunched over, his figure appearing even thinner, perhaps due to the long journey. His loose robe swayed gently, emphasizing his well-defined wrists and ankles. Deep wrinkles on his face revealed an indomitable wisdom, and his gray beard hung haphazardly over his chest, clearly indicating that the fatigue of his journey had not yet completely subsided. This man introduced himself as Alvis. The other man had a sharply defined face, high cheekbones, and deep-set eyes, yet his eyes still gleamed with a sharp light, like a sharpened blade, constantly alert to any movement around him. This man introduced himself as Malek, Alvis's bodyguard. Alvis? You are Scholar Alvis. Stanford stood up in surprise when the man who called himself a scholar announced his name. Alvis returned the same surprised expression. Although he was famous throughout Gabella, he was currently separated from Gabella by a vast grassland. Alvis was unaware that the high-ranking administrators within the Alda system were among the most well-informed people in the world. The State Council regularly compiles intelligence gathered from various parts of the world and distributes it to all departments in the form of an internal newspaper for officials at all levels to read. The sources of this intelligence are diverse, including intelligence personnel, merchants, and envoys stationed abroad. In particular, information about another continent, about strange countries with inhabitants of strikingly different appearances, is becoming increasingly known to Alda thanks to the increasing number of transoceanic fleets traveling to and from these places. This is information that even a learned scholar like Alvis was unaware of. Not to mention Gabella, located on the same continent and already having extensive exchanges with Waldo. The name of this high-ranking official in the Empire is not unfamiliar to high-ranking officials like Stanford, and Alvis is naturally one of them. "You know me?" the old scholar asked, quite puzzled. "Of course, Mr. Alvis, you are a senior scholar in the Scholar's Tower, second only to Master Aldrich." Stanford gave him a Gabella salute. Alvis gave a wry smile. "Second only to Aldrich, a high-ranking scholar? That's all in the past. I'm now just a fugitive from the Empire." Stanford was taken aback. "What happened, Master Alvis?" The Gabella Empire hadn't publicized Alvis's departure, and Alda didn't actively inquire about non-critical matters, relying more on gathering publicly available information. So, despite the passage of time, Stanford was unaware of the internal changes within the Empire's upper echelons. Alvis frowned slightly and said seriously, "I'd like to ask, Mr. Stanford, whether you, or rather, Marcus Gleman behind you, are willing to provide me and my attendants with safe haven. I don't want to deceive you. Assassins appointed by Emperor Antonio Griffin himself may still be hunting me. Providing me with shelter would risk offending the Emperor." On his way to the Black Worm's Nest, Alvis had already learned about the general situation in the northern Three Lands and the Northwest Bay from the older people, knowing that Paul Gleman was the ruler there. His words didn't surprise Stanford too much. Former high-ranking officials of a country fleeing to a foreign land, seeking political asylum, was a common occurrence, both in the past and present. Stanford calmly asked, "Could you tell me about your experience first?" Alvis nodded. "Oh. Of course, this is something you should know before making your decision. Please forgive my earlier bluntness, but the constant flight has left me like a bird nearly struck by an arrow, living in constant fear. My mind is no longer sound. First, I must state that Emperor Antonio Griffin of Gabella once plotted a terrible scheme against your country, Alder, and he succeeded. This scheme plunged Alder into war, caused the loss of its territory, and enslaved its people to foreign tribes." Stanford easily deduced that he was referring to the Orcish invasion. "And I, because I vehemently opposed this conspiracy, ultimately broke with the Emperor, became unwelcome in Gabella, and was forced to leave the Scholar's Tower, embarking on a journey of escape. My purpose was to go to Alder, to warn you that the Emperor's conspiracy is still ongoing. I originally intended to take the Narradan corridor directly, and also to see the land that had fallen under the iron heel of the orcs, but unfortunately I was pursued by assassins and forced to abandon my planned route, instead taking a detour through the Great Plains. Misfortune struck again. I was sold as a slave to an orc tribe by an untrustworthy and unscrupulous merchant. Fortunately, the ruler there saw that I had some knowledge and did not treat me as a laborer." Alvis recounted his experiences over the past year in detail. Stanford listened quietly, then thought for a moment before replying, "I can only say that our Department of Public Security will provide personal safety protection for all those who abide by the laws of Aldo within our territory, whether they are from our own country or from another. However, this protection is primarily achieved through deterrence. In the event of serious incidents such as murder or kidnapping, the Department of Public Security will investigate them as criminal cases and, to the best of its ability, apprehend, try, and punish the perpetrators. As for further asylum, especially involving high-ranking foreign officials like yourself, I have no authority to decide. However, I can write to Lockhart or arrange for you to go there directly to inquire about Marcus Gleman's opinion. If it were a chieftain or headman of any of the 3 northern tribes seeking asylum, that would fall within Stanford's jurisdiction, and he would handle it himself. But Gabella is a different story. It's a powerful nation that dominates the central part of the continent. In Stanford's view, even to his own lord, Alvis is a hot potato. Perhaps his lord, like himself, will pass this hot potato to Crystal Radiance, giving King Rodney 18 a headache. I thank you for your frankness, Mr. Stanford." Alvis thanked him. "I would like to see Marcus Gleman in person. There are some things I need to clarify with him face to face." Chapter 756. Under Stanford's arrangement, Alvis and his bodyguard, Malek, boarded a mail ship bound for Northwest Bay, with a crew to escort him to Lake Town. The two, who had always lived inland, were amazed by the large ships that could sail without oarsmen. Alvis, a scholar, was intrigued and inquired in detail about the principles of sailing from the sailors. There was no need to keep this a secret, and the crew, fond of the distinguished yet amiable old man, readily answered his questions. After several days' voyage, the ship arrived at Port Franklin. Alvis, upon disembarking, was struck by the city's prosperity. The more learned a person is, the more they rely on existing knowledge to observe and understand the world. In Alvis's previous geographical knowledge, Northwest Bay was a primitive, backward, and isolated place. However, what he saw with his own eyes was completely different from the descriptions in books. When they arrived in Lake Town, a grand wedding was taking place. Paul and Catherine, the Gleman and Rodney families, the lords of the Northwest and the royal family of Crystal Radiance, on this day, a stronger and more secure bond was formed. The mission dispatched by Stanford was not only to protect Alvis, but also to represent Stanford and the 3 northern territories in presenting gifts and sincere blessings to the Lord's wedding. The Lord's manor in Lacquer Town, freshly painted inside and out, a blend of luxury and solemnity, showcased the glory and status of the only Marcus in the Kingdom of Aldo. From here, the newlyweds boarded a carriage to the church in Lacquer Town for their formal wedding ceremony. Beneath the soaring vaulted ceiling of the lakeside cathedral, stained glass windows let in dappled light, illuminating the ornately decorated altar. Catherine, in a long silk gown embroidered with the gold thread and a jeweled crown, held a bouquet of lilies symbolizing purity. Paul, in a magnificent suit embroidered with the family crest and a finely decorated knightsword at his waist, walked hand in hand to the altar and, under the auspices of Bishop Leonard, was married. The guests, dressed in finery and adorned with jewels, conversed in hushed tones. The air was filled with the fragrance of spices and flowers, and solemn prayers echoed throughout the church. After the ceremony, the guests moved to the Lord's Castle Hall to enjoy a sumptuous feast. Tables were laden with delicious dishes and exquisite desserts. Musicians played melodious tunes, and dancers performed graceful dances. The celebration would last for several days, a display of unparalleled luxury and joy. The highest-ranking guest at the wedding was King Rodney's VIE of the Kingdom of Alder. His last visit to the Northwest Bay was at the behest of the previous King Rodney. Now, revisiting as king, he was struck by the Northwest Bay's rapid development, which had transformed it beyond recognition in just a few years. Stanford's men requested a private audience with the Lord, which was granted, and they met Paul Gleman, still in his formal attire. They relayed the wedding wishes from the military and political leaders of the 3 northern regions and then discussed the matter of Alvis. "This is quite unexpected, people from the Bachelor's Tower of Gabella," Paul recalled years ago when a scholar named Mon Langdon, also from the Bachelor's Tower, came to the Northwest Bay demanding a young man suspected of rioting. In exchange, Mon promised to recommend his classmates to work in Arda. Indeed, several scholars arrived, playing a significant role in Arda's dire shortage of talent at the time. Unexpectedly, the second-in-command of the Scholars' Tower had also come to his place. Paul summoned a servant and instructed, "Protect Master Alvis's safety, I will meet with him as soon as possible." The following afternoon, Alvis was invited into the Lord's mansion and met Paul Gleman in the reception room. "I can tell, Lord Gleman, you had a wonderful night." Although Alvis was over 50, he was vigorous, elegant, and spoke with poise and wit. Paul, on the other hand, was radiant and had a ruddy complexion. He and Catherine had just completed a major stage in their lives, and both had grown considerably. The young Marcus smiled slightly and gestured towards the sofa. "Please sit, Master Jarvis." After they were both seated, Paul said, "I have heard of your deeds. As an Aldo, or rather, as a human, I greatly admire your willingness to stand on the side of all humanity. Alice, how wonderful it would be if the human nations could unite to annihilate the orcs. Unfortunately, in reality, there are always various things that make me wary of each other, even leading to conflict, giving these bandits an opportunity to plunder the poor civilians. By the way, regarding the matter between the new Emperor of Gabera and the orcs, do you have anything to add?" Jarvis nodded. "In recent years, I have been diligently studying the many mysterious events that have occurred in the Northwest Bay and even in Aldo over the past few years. I have a vague feeling that you, Marcus Paul Gleman, are behind this series of events, or rather, some kind of driving force, or perhaps it would be more appropriate to use the analogy of the core of a vortex." Paul raised an eyebrow, a mixture of surprise and smugness in his eyes. "You flatter me, Scholar Alvis. The real driving force is the masses living on this land. I was merely going with the flow." Alvis smiled slightly. "Because of all this, after arriving in Alder, I didn't seek out your king, but instead went to you, Marcus Gleman. I believe only you have the ability to resolve the crisis we face today. Now, let's return to the main topic. The matter concerning Emperor Antonio Griffin of Gabella is not as simple as you know. Oh? I'd like to hear more. The Orc invasion that Alder suffered originated directly from the peace treaty between Emperor Gabella and the Orc chieftain. This peace treaty came at the cost of Alder. The Emperor used his informants, who were infiltrated within the kingdom. Because of their covert cooperation, the Orcs' attack was so successful, even bringing the entire northeastern territory of the kingdom under their rule. Actually, Gabella isn't incapable of defeating the Orcs. The reason the Emperor was so eager to make peace, even going so far as to activate his long-dormant agents, is because his power was not yet secure. There were many who opposed him within Gabella, and he needed to prioritize dealing with them. Paul asked, could it be that his power wasn't entirely legitimate? Alvis confirmed, yes. Chapter 757. Any rumors in Aldo about Emperor Antonio Griffin's succession to the throne of Gabera? Asked Alvis. Paul thought for a moment and said, it's said that the previous emperor designated Antonio as his successor, but his unwilling brother launched a rebellion. Antonio swiftly crushed the rebellion and finally succeeded to the throne. In fact, he already knew much of the truth from the wizard Urson, but it's always wise to listen to both sides. What Alvis said corroborated what Urson had said. Alvis nodded. That's indeed the version the public knows. The public knows. In fact, Alvis explained, the previous emperor, Barley Griffin, hadn't decided on his successor. The one who actually started the rebellion was Antonio. Of course, his brother Felix Griffin was indeed inferior to Antonio in every way. I also supported Antonio at the time, and even contributed to his coup. Well, that's quite common in history. Paul feigned surprise, as if he'd never heard of this before. Since someone as wise and learned as you supports Antonio Griffin, he must be very popular in Gabera. If His Majesty Bartley had declared him his successor earlier, instead of leaving this coveted position unresolved, perhaps his later years would have been more peaceful. Alvis then showed a regretful expression. Antonio was indeed excellent, with outstanding political and military abilities. At least in the eyes of us in the Maester's Tower, he was the most suitable person to rule the Empire, but unfortunately, his origins are somewhat questionable. A strange look flashed across Alvis's face. In Gabella, there's a widespread rumor. Antonio is the child of a witch. The child of a witch? Oh, it seems His Majesty the Emperor grew up under the scrutiny of others. Alvis nodded. Exactly, we have a saying there, a witch's offspring, whether or not they possess magic, will be a monster. Paul gave a soft hum, which aroused Alvis's suspicion. Lord Griles, did I say something wrong? Paul quickly said, no. Please continue, Master Alvis, then I will continue. This is precisely why Bartley has been unable to decide on an heir. If it were merely a rumor, it would not affect the Emperor's will. The key is, Alvis frowned and lowered his voice, this rumor is true. Antonio's birth mother, Slona Hewitt, is a witch. She comes from a long-established organization of spellcasters, the Arcane Society, and is the daughter of the Arcane Society's leader, Seiko Hewitt. The Arcane Society? Paul heard the name of this wizarding group again. Barnett, who instigated the War of the Usurpers in the Northwest Bay, belonged to this wizarding organization. His mother, Mariana, also belonged to this organization, as did the Tezen. Now, this organization had also become involved with a new emperor of Gabella. Alvisha suddenly asked, you don't seem surprised. Paul countered, what should I be surprised about? Wizards, magic. Should it be surprising to hear these words from the mouth of a scholar from the Maester's Tower who reveres knowledge and reason? You know, many high-ranking nobles like yourself scoff at such things, considering them nothing more than country superstition. Paul was speechless. How was he supposed to explain? Should he reveal to Alvishi that he had a witch subordinate named Laddie, a witch mother named Mariana, a wizard worshipper named Dezen, and that he allowed a group of Horn Bay wizards to reside in his territory? He said, look, the war at Horn Bay has lasted so long, and Eton has even declared its recognition of the equal status of wizards. Many secrets that were previously unknown have come to light. We must acknowledge that some things objectively exist, mustn't we? Alvis nodded. It seems I've been wandering the grasslands for too long and have fallen behind the times, he continued. What I'm about to tell you will involve some mysticism, but since this world already has wizards and magic, it's not impossible that other similar things exist. Alvis then recounted to Paul in detail the prophecy of the Star of Calamity, the legends of the ancient demons, the alliance between the Scholar's Tower and the Arcane Council, and a series of other events. He also read aloud the notes left by the priests of the ancient civilization. When it appeared between heaven and earth for the 10th time, the great destroyer came to this world from the other world through a non-existent gate. He created his own kin on earth and forged his army from steel. They wielded weapons that breathed fire and slaughtered all living beings of flesh and blood. The kin celebrated their victory and erected stone pillars on the earth to worship him. A malevolent black mist spewed from the top of the stone pillars, obscuring the sun, moon, and stars. Nauseating black water flowed from the base, infiltrating rivers and seas. These evil creatures created countless plagues and monsters among humankind. Under the ravages of the great destroyer, the world descended into chaos. People's minds were corrupted, their thoughts twisted, lofty morality was abandoned, perfect order was trampled, the era of heroes and wise kings ended, and the old civilization was gone forever. Noble people became lambs to the slaughter, and the once gentle populace became ferocious beasts, viciously attacking their former masters. An era of utter chaos has arrived. Paul listened, utterly bewildered. What was this? Another worldly version of the Cthulhu mythos? Last time it was read from Dezen's mouth, and this time from Alvis's, both with such solemn expressions. Did they really believe in such absurd things so deeply? Then, a thought suddenly occurred to him. Wait, how do I know you are the real Master Alvis? Do you have any means of proving your identity? Alvis was silent for a moment, then said helplessly, Unfortunately, I have no means of proving my identity. I used to have a small golden seal of the Scholar's Tower, but I lost it on the run. Alright, please continue. The conversation with Alvis lasted for an afternoon. Basically, what the old scholar said was roughly the same as what the wizard Dezen had told him. Perhaps he could give Dezen more trust? After seeing Alvis off, Paul asked, was there anything unusual about him? The figure that emerged from behind the screen replied, No, sir, no signs of lying were detected. Paul said somewhat helplessly, Laddie, perhaps you could speak to me in a more friendly tone. Chapter 758. Besides Laddie's confirmation, Paul also consulted Princess Irene, who had studied in the Scholar's Tower, to confirm that Alvis was not an imposter. Paul then instructed the Public Security Department to assign a specialist to provide Alvis with proactive protection, believing him to be invaluable. From Dezen, Marianne, and Alvis, he learned about the Arcane Society and the ancient prophecy, essentially confirming the truth, not that he believed the ancient prophecy was correct, but that the Arcane Society was indeed actively pushing forward with this ethereal prophecy. Giles' rebellion, the Orcish invasion, clearly, the other side had treated Alder as prey, ready to carve out pieces as needed, with the ultimate goal of swallowing them whole, not just Alder, but all of human civilization. They were too passive. It was time to take the initiative. So, what brings you here? Marianne asked her son with a smile. Paul replied, regarding the Mystic Society's schemes. The serious expression on her son's face made Marianne's initial ease vanish. Schemes? Oh dear, that word is far too offensive. Paul frowned and asked, Mrs. Gleman, what is your position in the Mystic Society? His curt address displeased Marianne. Well, how should I put it? She seemed hesitant. While it might sound arrogant, my position certainly doesn't mean my words go unheard. Paul continued, then let me ask you further, how strong is your sense of belonging to this organization? Or rather, how deep is your connection to it? Marianne was silent for a moment, then frowned, her voice becoming sharp. Well, it seems this day has finally come. My son is forcing me to make a choice, him, or the cause I'm fighting for. Paul sneered, laying his cards on the table. Considering you already did it once 10 years ago, I don't have high expectations for your choice. Marianne stood up abruptly, her porcelain white face flushing red. She was clearly angry. Almost instantly, a powerful sense of oppression emanated from the red-haired witch, and the air in the room seemed to freeze. Paul felt as if he were encased in concrete, unable to move or breathe. The witch seemed to be engulfed in flames. Paul Gleman, she said, listen to me. I, Marianne Gleman, may have made many mistakes, but not my 2 children. I feel guilty for missing more than 10 years of your life, but I can't bear the consequences of not leaving you, consequences that still concern you, and even the entire Gleman family. Calm down, mother, Paul pleaded. Damn it, what have I done? The word mother spurred Marianne into action. Her pupils dilated, and she instantly transformed from a furious witch into a weak and pitiful woman. Staggering forward a few steps, Marianne grabbed Paul, holding her son tightly in her arms, and 2 streams of tears flowed from her eyes like broken beads. Forgive me, Paul, it's all that damn Vatican's fault. If those hounds hadn't come here to investigate, how happy we would have been. Before the painful separation from you, I had no idea what arcane magic was. As if to release the emotions that had been building up inside her for years, Marianne hugged Paul and burst into tears. What? I really can't breathe this time. Paul's voice came from her arms. I'm sorry, she released her son. Paul, freed, gasped for breath. Marianne also calmed down, and between sobs, recounted to Paul the whole story of her departure. Years ago, after discovering her whereabouts, the Vatican quickly dispatched a secret force to Northwest Bay to capture the Crimson Witch. Leonard, now the Bishop of Northwest Bay, was the one in the local church responsible for cooperating with the Vatican's secret force. Coincidentally, Leonard was on good terms with old Gleman, and he was shocked when he learned that the Vatican was after his friend's wife. Leonard, a devout believer and a staunch follower of the papacy, concluded that since the papacy had spoken, Mrs. Gleman must be the witch. However, after a painful internal struggle, he secretly informed the elderly Glemans that the papacy's operation against them was imminent. Marianne, having just given birth to her second child, was powerless against the papacy's secret forces, and the Gleman family, then merely weak lords in a remote region, was no match for the behemoth that was the papacy. Marianne intended to hide for a while, but Leonard warned her, either leave the Northwest Bay forever and never set foot on that land again, or he would summon the papacy's secret forces to arrest the entire Gleman family. Thus, Marianne was forced to painfully leave her husband and eldest son. In the days I spent missing you, my hatred for the papacy grew deeper and deeper, so I accepted the invitation of the Mystic Order and became one of them. One of the Mystic Order's goals is to allow spellcasters to walk openly in the sunlight, and to achieve this goal, there is a prerequisite, the destruction of the papacy. Because of Leonard's warning, I dare not return to the Northwest Bay. I suppose you've had contact with him. He's an extremely stubborn man, and he does what he says without hesitation. It wasn't until I confirmed that Leonard was no longer permanently stationed in Arda due to his promotion to bishop, and that you had gained some strength to protect yourself, that I cautiously returned here and reunited with you. Mariana's words reminded Paul of his wedding. During the ceremony, Mariana, disguised among the guests, looked at Leonard with a complex expression. Indeed, someone who both saved your life and ruined your life, should you be grateful or hate them? After listening, Paul embraced Mariana. Mother, the days ahead may become increasingly chaotic. I respect your aspirations and will not force you to make a choice, but I implore you to prioritize your own safety and adjust your position as needed. I absolutely do not wish for us to ever become adversaries. I don't care what the Arcane Society wants to do, but if its goals conflict with mine, I will do everything in my power to thwart their schemes. At the very least, all their efforts in order will be in vain. Chapter 759. Mariana was very worried about what Paul had said. Paul, I must remind you, as a long-established organization, the Arcane Society is incredibly powerful, and now it completely controls the Gabella Empire. The Northwest Bay alone cannot contend with it, she said seriously. I know you can create many novel things here, like muskets and cannons. I admit they are incredibly powerful and can easily defeat traditional armies. But have you considered that these are all created by ordinary people? The Arcane Society has a natural advantage. They can do what ordinary people can do, but what they can do, magic, ordinary people cannot. They can steal your technology and create muskets and cannons, while you cannot steal their magic. Even if I stand on your side, even if I am incredibly proud of my magical abilities, I cannot help you contend with such a massive organization. You only possess the technology, but they can possess both technology and magic, a 1-to-2 disadvantage. Paul's expression remained calm. Mother, although you know about muskets and cannons, I must say that these things are merely the end of a chain. This chain will grow longer and longer, eventually evolving into a vast system that cannot be created overnight. Marianne paused. That sounds complicated, of course. I've taken you to visit an ironworks. Do you think you can replicate one elsewhere based on your memory of that visit? The self-strengthening movement in late Qing Dynasty China, India after its founding, and the reindustrialization of the United States, did they try? They tried, but with little success. When an industrial system becomes complex enough, replicating it is not easy. Marianne thought for a moment, then shook her head and said, no. Paul was somewhat smug. Even if the mathematicians were truly capable of replicating an ironworks 1-to-1, what use would all that iron they produced be? So, it's all about skill and method. Besides, it's not like I can't accommodate spellcasters here. A dozen or so from Horn Bay have already sought refuge here, Mariana sighed. Alright, it seems I can't persuade you. Take care of yourself, Paul. I'll consider your suggestion carefully. Perhaps I lack understanding of your power, but for now, I think it's better for me to stay in the Arcane Council, so that I can protect you if you face an insurmountable predicament in the future. She suddenly smiled slyly. Conversely, if Nathan and I were to face an insurmountable predicament in the future, I hope you can lend a hand. Even if things don't turn out as I hope, at least one of you and Nathan will survive and continue the Griles family bloodline, Paul said. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, Mariana smiled slightly. A very apt analogy, Paul said. In that case, let's not let our relationship spread further. It doesn't matter to me, but it might cause trouble for your situation over there. Mariana was delighted by his words. I'm very touched. Thank you for being so considerate of your mother, Paul then asked. It sounds like your main reason for joining the Arcane Society is to rebel against the Church. What's your opinion on the so-called ancient prophecy? Speaking of which, Mariana's expression turned serious again. At first, I was dismissive, but the longer I stayed in the Arcane Society, the more I realized that the prophecy wasn't entirely unfounded. In short, it's definitely not, as you said last time, a fabricated excuse for spellcasters to gain social status, because the entire organization is now acting around this prophecy. Paul, I advise you to be prepared. If the world really changes one day in the future, perhaps your power will come in handy, and maybe the Arcane Society will even try to unite with you. Seeing Mariana's seriousness, Paul abandoned his dismissive attitude. Alright, I'll keep an eye on it. After talking with Mariana, Paul went to see Rodney's VIE and told him what he knew about the Arcane Society and Gabella, except for things related to Mariana. He had prepared beforehand, and his narration made it sound to His Majesty the King as if he himself had only recently learned of the matter. Rodney's VIE's expression turned grave after hearing this. I thank you for your timely notification, Paul. In fact, I've long suspected that the Aldor are entangled in a vast, intricate web of intrigue. The Highland barbarians, the Aldor, Veblen, the Orcs, these terrible things always seem to come one after another, keeping the kingdom's government constantly on its toes and relentlessly draining its already limited resources. Count Morin's intelligence agents have also uncovered some clues, but they always falter, and we can never piece together the whole picture from the fragments. Now, although our predicament hasn't lessened in the slightest, at least we know where the mastermind is. The Gabella Empire? It's truly unexpected. We're separated from this country by an entire plateau, and we've never had any conflicts of interest with them, yet they've gone to such lengths. Paul reminded him, it's mainly because of the Arcane Society. Oh right, the Arcane Society. Rodney's VIE gritted his teeth bitterly. It really fits the stereotype of wizards, secretly using witchcraft to control the country's elite and gradually manipulating the entire nation. And that Antonio Griffin, what a wicked monster born of a witch. I even sent envoys all the way to congratulate him when he ascended the throne. I bet he was secretly laughing at me for being a fool who was sold out and still counting the money. God, curse him. Rodney's VIE seemed to be venting all the pressure he had been under since taking the throne. He, who is usually known for his composure, cursed incessantly for half an hour. After he calmed down a bit, Paul said, Your Majesty, I believe the most urgent task is to save the kingdom from its disintegration. Rodney agreed. Yes, he placed his hand on Paul's shoulder, his eyes sincere and fervent. The reason I came to the Northwest Bay for your wedding is to show the world that the union of Rodney and Griles will be close and inseparable. Our two families will stand back to back amidst the chaos, relying on each other. Griles will keep an eye on the Orcs in the north, while Rodney will deal with Giles and Veblen in the south. Ultimately, the entire Aldor will be united once again by these two families. Chapter 760. Immediately after Paul and Catherine's wedding, Rodney's VIE set off south, his mind filled with unease at the information Paul had shared about the secret society. On his return journey, Rodney's VIE specifically requested to travel back to Crystal Radiance aboard a warship of the Arden Navy. Paul granted the king's wish, assigning a small fleet of 3 warships to escort Rodney's VIE to Westport, the closest port to Crystal Radiance. Accompanying him was Melon Garnard, head of the Royal Economic Zone, who was also returning to the Northwest Bay for Paul's wedding. The Royal Economic Zone had become a significant source of tax revenue for the kingdom, and Melon had become Rodney's VIE's trusted right-hand man. Besides Mellon, there was also Viscount Willem Dillon, a former Westport official, and Harrison, the eldest son of the Abbott family. These men whom Rodney's VIE relied on shared some common traits: youth, active minds, interest in new things, and a lack of respect for tradition. After landing in Westport, Rodney's VIE traveled at a leisurely pace, stopping frequently and wandering around. What should have been a half-day journey by fast horse took him nearly 2 days. His Majesty the King's dawdling was due to a surveying of the terrain between Westport and Jingayao, and his intention to lay a railway connecting the two cities. Rodney's VIE witnessed the construction of the railway in the Northwest Bay. Intrigued by anything new in the Northwest Bay, he learned that it was a high-speed, high-capacity, and efficient transportation system powered solely by machines, not by animals. His curiosity was piqued. Upon further inquiry, Paul showed him an oil painting depicting the completed train and railway. Through comparison with other elements in the painting, Rodney's VIE glimpsed this iconic industrial behemoth. Though only depicted in a painting, its immense power was still awe-inspiring to all who witnessed it. Huge wheels rolled over the tracks, the locomotives spewed thick white smoke, steam billowed and rose, piercing the sky, and the steel dragon traversed the plains. The train, riveted together from thick steel plates, resembled a series of steel fortresses strung together. The entire train, like a giant beast breaking free of its restraints, swept through all obstacles with overwhelming force. "We need to find a way to build a railway," Rodney's VIE immediately decided. Currently, the Royal Territory has two centers, Crystal Radiance as the political center and Westport as the economic center. Although geographically close, the king wanted to connect these two centers more closely, and without a doubt, a railway was the best way to achieve this goal. Upon returning to Crystal Radiance, Rodney's VIE enthusiastically held a military review. After more than a year of training, the kingdom's new army had begun to show results, and the young king was eager to test the army's progress. In the square in front of the palace, the new army soldiers stood in neat formations, their faces solemn, their eyes resolute. They wore crisp uniforms, their bright colors gleaming in the sunlight, the brass buttons and epaulets on their chests flashing with a cold light. As Rodney's VIE announced the start of the parade, the soldiers began to move in perfect unison, like a moving wall, their steps synchronized and deafening, as if the square itself were trembling. Their movements were precise and powerful. Their bayonets gleamed coldly in the sunlight, their rifle barrels stood straight as a forest, exuding an inviolable aura, every movement brimming with strength. 10 contingents rolled across the square like steamrollers, proclaiming that the Alder royal family had once again gained control of a powerful armed force. Many were present to observe the parade, including some of Giles's men stationed in Crystal Radiance, some openly, some covertly. News of the king's parade quickly reached Five Ram City, raising high alert among Grand Duke Giles. What terrified him most was that, in addition to the soldiers' impressive skill, the king's army also featured muskets and cannons, powerful new weapons against which Giles's troops had suffered greatly during the Battle of Horn Bay. Giles managed to obtain some black powder, supposedly a key ingredient in the weapons used by the Arda army. He gave it to his alchemists in an attempt to decipher its secrets. The alchemists were overjoyed and immediately began their work. It was a finely ground powder, the composition of which could not be determined by visual inspection alone. However, they identified sulfur by the pungent odor of the burning powder, but since sulfur is not a black powder, it was likely a mixture containing sulfur. The alchemists requested more samples for further study, a task Giles assigned to his spies infiltrating Arda. Things went relatively smoothly. His spies gradually brought back several more batches of black powder from the heavily guarded Arda military-industrial system. The alchemists continued their research, but they isolated all sorts of strange substances from it, such as saltpeter, coal dust, flour, and even pepper. They mixed some of the known ingredients, but only produced a pile of combustible powder. They failed to reproduce the intense combustion of the original black powder. It seemed the alchemists still had a long way to go to live up to the generous treatment His Highness had given them. Besides reproducing the black powder, Giles also considered some form of defense against the deadly metal projectiles, large and small. However, the calculations were pessimistic. During the Battle of Horn Bay, Giles had done everything he could to enhance the defenses of his prized army, the undead, without hindering their movement. Even the thick metal armor worn by the robust undead soldiers couldn't withstand a small projectile at considerable distance, let alone the large metal projectiles. Once those hide a dense crowd, They were practically indiscriminate killers. Giles had a premonition that he and Paul Gleman would inevitably clash again, so he and his vassals racked their brains to develop an effective defensive system. However, before he could come up with a good solution, news arrived that the king was holding a large-scale military review in Crystal Radiance. Perhaps Rodney's VIE wants to intimidate the orcs in the north, the vassals advised their anxious lord. But Giles didn't think so. According to his intelligence, the north of Alder seemed to have been entrusted by Rodney's VIE to Paul Gleman, who also commanded a powerful army. Chapter 761. Giles's fears soon became a reality. Shortly after the military parade, King Rodney's VIE summoned his resident envoy, stationed at Crystal Glory, to the palace and berated him, listing all of Giles's past disrespect towards the royal family. Without instructions from Grand Duke Reed, the envoy could only silently endure the king's scolding. After his outburst, Rodney's VIE abruptly demanded that Giles personally come to Crystal Glory to confess his crimes. The king's scribe faithfully recorded the scene. Initially, Giles's envoy, Patterson, strode into the audience hall, head held high, chest puffed out, his face arrogant. Since the peace agreement between the royal family and Giles was established, Patterson had been stationed at Crystal Glory by Giles to handle liaison with the royal family in other matters. Relying on Giles's power, Patterson had always presented himself in this manner in the capital. Because everyone knew that the royal family couldn't do anything to Giles, and although Giles couldn't do anything to the royal family either, the royal family, which should have been in a superior position, was in such an awkward situation, which many considered a defeat. Inside the audience hall, cabinet ministers, the king's advisors, and many other high-ranking officials lined both sides. Patterson quickly sensed an unusual atmosphere. His keen senses soon revealed that everyone was looking at him with stern eyes. This isn't proper hospitality, Patterson complained inwardly. He had always considered himself a guest of the Radiant Empire, not a subject of the kingdom. He only pledged allegiance to Grand Duke Giles. As he approached, the shadow of the throne loomed over him, and the stern, uncomfortable atmosphere intensified. Bang! A loud thud echoed in the audience hall, the sound of the Master of Ceremonies slamming his scepter against the ground. Kneel, the Master of Ceremonies' booming voice resounded throughout the hall. While kneeling existed in Alder aristocratic etiquette, it was uncommon, usually reserved for significant occasions such as the investiture of vassals by their lord, or when a vassal confessed his sins to his lord. What was going on today? Patterson was inwardly terrified. In previous audiences, he had never received such treatment. The king would usually exchange pleasantries with him, inquiring about Giles's and his own health, and discussing recent amusing events in Crystal Palace. But today, it felt like falling into an ice cave. It wasn't hard to see that Rodney 18 was looking for trouble with him, or rather, with Giles behind him. Kneel, seeing Patterson's stunned expression, the Master of Ceremonies repeated loudly. Patterson suppressed his inner turmoil, striving to appear composed. Your Majesty, Lord Rodney's VIE, could you please explain what has happened to cause Lord Giles's envoy to be treated so coldly? Is it the slander of a despicable person, or the machinations of a jealous individual, that has caused a rift in the relationship between the royal family and the Southern Territory? A figure emerged from the ranks of the kingdom's higher-ranking officials. Earl Morn coldly addressed Patterson. It is your master, Giles. He has committed an unforgivable crime of treason, and you, as his envoy in Crystal Radiance, must stand trial in his place. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed as imposing palace guards approached Patterson, one on each side, forcefully pressing down on his shoulders. Patterson realized that if he resisted, something terrible might happen. He angrily declared, I will report everything that happened today to His Highness Giles truthfully, and then knelt down with a thud. The throne reflected a cold light in the firelight. King Rodney's VIE stroked the armrest, casting a stern gaze upon Patterson below. He spoke sharply. 300 years ago, Giles' ancestor swore an oath of loyalty to the royal family right here. He probably never imagined that such a sacred oath would be broken by his own descendants. Your Majesty, this is slander. Prince Giles has always been loyal to the kingdom, Patterson vehemently defended his lord. Loyal to the kingdom, Rodney's VIE said angrily, raising an army to attack the royal territory, driving out other lords in the south, and resisting the royal army's southward advance. Is this what loyalty to the kingdom looks like? Oh. He may be loyal to the kingdom of Alder, but to Giles Alder, if his ambitions are realized, not to Rodney's Alder, am I right? Faced with the king's stern questioning, Patterson lowered his head, remaining silent. Has the northern wind chilled your tongue? The king's voice even startled the birds outside the audience hall. Or perhaps Giles never anticipated this situation and failed to teach you how to speak. The chainmail of the palace guards jingled in the silence. Rodney's Vidai gestured to the Lord Keeper of the Seals, who unrolled a scroll and began to read aloud. The scroll contained a record of Giles's crimes, one after another, including the few offenses Rodney's Vidai had just mentioned, filling a thick book. The royal family was about to turn against Giles. Patterson, forced to listen to his lord's record of crimes, was resigned, but he hadn't expected such a terrible situation, being summoned before him and subjected to tirade. After the Keeper of the Seal finished reading, the king said coldly, "Although Giles has committed a crime that cannot be easily forgiven, as a benevolent ruler, I am not always willing to resort to force." Listen carefully, Patterson. Patterson looked at the king, trying to find any guilty conscience in the young king's eyes. Perhaps the king was just trying to intimidate him with bluster, but unfortunately, he failed. Rodney's Vidai's eyes only showed determination and indifference. He found no trace of guilt. He continued, "As long as Giles comes here in person to apologize to me, I will still give him a dignified end." What a joke. Patterson scoffed inwardly. Giles might really come here, but he would definitely come with an army. "My lord will not accept such absurd slander," Patterson said. "He will uphold the sacred traditions of antiquity and defend his rights by reasonable means, including force, of course, even against you, your majesty the king. So, he's determined to confront the royal family to the end," Rodney's Vidai said coldly. Patterson's answer was not unexpected, or rather, it was the situation he wanted. "In that case, let him explain to the royal army. I will send troops south to arrest the so-called Grand Duke of Greed and imprison him in a prison cart all the way to Crystal Radiance." The king's attitude showed no sign of softening. Finally, he ordered Patterson to be expelled from the palace. The audience was recorded in detail and widely disseminated through newspapers and other publications. Soon after, everyone knew that the king was going to take action against Giles in the south. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 762. Before Rodney's Vidai summoned Giles's envoy, the kingdom's war preparations had already begun long ago. The busiest units during that period were the various logistics units within the army. In the cast iron alley of the southern district of Crystal City, still shrouded in a gray-blue morning mist, logistics officer Edmund White had already kicked open the door of the third blacksmith shop. The unfinished breastplate on the anvil glowed with a dark red warmth. The old blacksmith, wrapped in a leather apron, looked up from the pile of coals, his cloudy eyes narrowing sharply upon seeing the emblem on the newcomer's chest. "You have 200 iron bars to deliver in 3 days." Edmund's leather boots crunched over the iron filings, and he slammed a metal file folder down beside the forge. "I'd like to inquire about your progress, sir. The fire in the furnace hasn't gone out." The burly old blacksmith held up his scalded hand. "But," Edmund immediately frowned, his thick eyebrows almost knitted together. "But what?" "I warned you, this job can't afford any mistakes. His Majesty the King is very concerned about the army's logistics. We're running low on iron ingots," Edmund said angrily. "You're really giving me trouble. You're only interested in taking money from His Majesty the King's pocket. Didn't you anticipate this kind of difficulty when you took this job? If we don't meet the quota, you and I will both be in trouble." "I'm sorry, sir." The quartermaster, hands behind his back, paced restlessly on the ground before finally saying, "All right, a batch of iron ingots will be arriving from West Harbor soon. These are originally for the army's own use. I'll try to apply for some to be allocated to your shop, but a portion of the final payment must be deducted as a penalty." The old blacksmith was overjoyed. "Thank you, Lord Edmund. The final payment is negotiable. I will definitely deliver on time." In Crystal Radiance and the surrounding towns, many blacksmith shops received similar orders from the army. The kingdom government ordered many military supplies directly from the Northwest Bay, where the workshops had large outputs and good quality. However, some less important components, such as cleaning rods for musket barrels, were handed over to workshops under its control. They couldn't just throw all their hard-earned silver coins into the Northwest Bay. Nevertheless, The vast majority of supplies directly used in combat were still transported by cargo ships from the Western Bay. The large-scale transport of supplies from West Harbor to Crystal Radiance had been ongoing for half a month, including weapons such as swords, spears, and armor, as well as important raw materials like iron ingots. To minimize disturbance, most transport operations were carried out at night and into the early morning. Before the morning mist had fully dissipated, the last convoy entered the White Oak camp outside the city. Figures moved in and out of the army warehouses, four-wheeled supply wagons forming a winding iron snake. The newly cast steel bearings on the axles gleamed with a faint blue light in the moonlight. These wagons were said to be a secret invention of the Northwest Bay, capable of carrying more than 4 times the load compared to traditional horse-drawn carriages. The chestnut geldings leading the wagon puffed white mist from their snot, their horseshoes breaking through the thin ice-covered ruts. The wooden crates on their wheels clattering with each bump. The receiving of supplies was extremely busy. The soldiers responsible for unloading moved back and forth in the warehouses like worker ants, carrying bags of iron and wooden crates. Logistics Officer Horn pulled open his wool scarf, his breath condensing into frost flowers on his brass-rimmed glasses. His sheepskin gloves, clutching the list, were covered in frost, yet he still managed to pinpoint the crack with a wool brush. 3 teeth are loose in the clasp of this wooden crate. Get the blacksmith to reinforce it, now. A soldier beside him responded and hurried out. In the old army, such a thing would be a trivial matter, but the instructors from Alda had established a strict accountability system for the Royal New Army, so Horn was conscientious and dared not be negligent in handling any supplies. "Watch out for that crate, don't go near the torch," he suddenly roared, startling the soldier carrying the crate so much he almost fell. Several soldiers nearby hurriedly braced the tilting crate, some black powder seeping from the corner. Gunpowder. It was no wonder Horn was angry to see the soldiers so close to the open flame. After much deliberation, Paul lifted the restriction on selling firearms to Crystal Radiance, but only to smoothbore muskets and cannons discarded by the Alda army. Furthermore, the gunpowder's raw material ratio was modified, and some impurities were added, reducing its power while increasing the difficulty of cracking its formula. The inventory of supplies required meticulous care. After a flurry of activity, Horn removed his hat to wipe the sweat from his brow. The officer in charge of the shipment unfolded the list, its edges wrinkled with sweat. "This batch is my responsibility: 20 crates of muskets, 4 6-pound cannons, and 50 barrels of gunpowder. If there are no problems, please sign here." Inventory correct. Horn took the list, spread it on the table, signed his name, and returned it to the officer. Similar scenes played out daily in the military warehouses near Crystal Radiance. Under King Rodney's VIE's orders, the Royal War Machine roared into action. Or rather, it was a steamroller, heading straight for the Southern Territory to crush the villains there. However, Giles, the one being crushed, was far from happy. The moment the golden cup shattered in the fireplace, splashed wine left gruesome claw marks on the tapestry. Grand Duke Giles clutched the gold-edged declaration of war, the parchment edges crumbling into gold leaf between his fingers, as if he wanted to crush Rodney's VIE's repulsive crown. That's not-nosed fledgling dares to declare war. Veins bulged on his forehead, his amber eyes burning fiercely. HMPH. Look at the force of this seal. A coward's stamp shines brighter than the late king's. The silver tray brought by a maid was cleaved in two by Giles's longsword in his rage, candied cherries rolling into the exquisite carpet. Giles said viciously, "Unbelievable. Just 3 months ago he was writing to me like a dog, calling me brother so affectionately." He suddenly froze. He remembered, it was the marriage alliance with the Marquis of Gleman of the Northwest Bay. Yes, it had shown the royal family's determination to attack him. Suddenly, the bronze mirror reflected his twitching lips. The man who had once forced the royal army to retreat back to Crystal Radiance was now trembling. Like an old horse encountering a pack of wolves on a snowy night. Giles hallucinated, seeing Paul Gleman's repulsive face. Gleman mocked him obsequiously. "Your Highness, I remember you said you'd teach me a lesson, to show me how cruel reality can be." "Damn it!" Giles waved his arms forward, trying to dispel the damned hallucination. "Rodney, Gleman, since you've chosen war, then let's wage war. Let's see if my undead army is stronger, or your toy soldiers." Chapter 763. Despite his anger, Giles remained quite cautious when it came to confronting the kingdom's army. Years ago, Giles's army and the kingdom's army clashed fiercely in the wilderness of Future, but neither side could gain the upper hand. The royal family was forced to acknowledge Giles's semi-independence, and his plan to march north and seize the Alder throne was thwarted. For a time afterward, Giles initially held the Crystal Radiance in contempt. He believed that if those damned wizards hadn't suddenly reduced their support, he could have become the new king of Alder, which was why he later built his own spellcasting force. Through the efforts of the wizards who had allied with him, Giles successfully expanded his undead army. While his own power grew, things changed on the Crystal Radiance side. The newly enthroned Rodney's Vilai, in order to weaken the influence of his uncle, the previous king, arranged a marriage between him and Catherine in the Northwest Bay. Suddenly, the Royal Knights, under Catherine's command and the core of the kingdom's military power, became unsettled. Giles felt his opportunity had arrived. If he led his army north now, he was certain he could defeat the royal army, thrown into chaos by the power transition. Unexpectedly, the orcs arrived. These barbarians of the plains swept into the northeastern borders of Alder like a whirlwind, countless towns falling under their iron hoofs. Faced with this situation, Giles changed his plans. He fantasized that perhaps he could reign supreme in Crystal Radiance under a different identity. He would wait for the orc army to advance further south, then lead his army north to display his prowess and drive the barbarians out of Alder's lands. The orc army was powerful, but Giles had great confidence in his own army, and he believed he would receive material and moral support from the northern lords. After all, they were all human, while Alder. Then, he could wash away the stigma of rebellion, become a hero protecting Alder, and further still, rightfully overthrow the current royal family and place the crown upon his own head. But things didn't go as planned. In the Battle of Ursola, the allied forces of the royal family and the northern lords won, halting the Orcish offensive. The orcs remained entrenched in the northeastern borders of Alder. When the external threat was significant enough but not powerful enough to eliminate them quickly, internal unity would emerge. From then on, the lords, who had become increasingly alienated from the royal family, began to respect the monarchy again. Especially after the Battle of Ursola, a famous saying emerged, "The Alder expects everyone to fulfill their duties." Giles felt a pang of jealousy upon hearing it. It was Paul Gleman who first uttered those words. "TCH, what a show-off," Giles scoffed. Though he didn't say it aloud, he harbored a deep envy for Paul Gleman. He himself had risked his life in rebellion, fighting countless battles to gain freedom from royal control, while this guy seemed to have achieved it simply by doing business. Damn it. If it weren't for me, Giles, constantly drawing aggro, your Northwest Bay would have been seized by the kingdom government long ago and used as a money bag. You even received the first marquisate in a century and won the heart of a beauty like Catherine. What a greenhorn. If the royal family hadn't always considered me, Giles, their number one enemy, would they have gone to such lengths to win you over? This guy even rejected my offer. He's utterly arrogant. Regardless, the kingdom's army still showed considerable resilience against the orcs. After careful evaluation, Giles felt he needed to expand his army further to push through Crystal Radiance in one fell swoop. However, the previous expansion had already strained his finances. At this time, the Corner Bay Church approached him, wanting to hire Giles's army to fight south. A way to both earn money and train soldiers, Giles quickly agreed. Then, Collins secretly approached him, proposing to raid Paul Gleman's leased territory in Corner Bay. Because of his dislike for Paul Gleman, Giles was more than happy to oblige. To Giles' surprise, his army suffered a defeat in the attack on Lion Harbor. His usual overconfidence in the undead army was a slap in the face. Unconvinced, he sent troops south, only to suffer another crushing defeat at the walls of Collins. This war deeply affected Giles. The quality and fighting prowess of the Alder soldiers astonished him. He was particularly surprised that Paul Gleman, whose territory was in the far northwest of Alder, actually had the means to deploy so many soldiers thousands of miles away, and by sea at that. Still clinging to outdated thinking, Giles failed to grasp the extent of maritime development in the Northwest Gulf. The defeat at Horn Bay dampened Giles' confidence, especially after news arrived from Crystal Radiance that the king had asked Paul Gleman to help him build a new army. He immediately felt an unprecedented threat. The kingdom's government was said to have alleviated its financial difficulties through something called military scrip, and if money were no longer a problem, the kingdom's army's sustained combat capability would be greatly enhanced. He instructed his spies to closely monitor the movements of the king's new army. Upon learning that Paul Gleman had equipped the king's army with powerful firearms, even his own undead army felt somewhat disheartened. Although the undead army had greatly enhanced their soldiers' combat abilities with potions, humans were still flesh and blood, and even with enhancements, there were limits. They couldn't withstand the onslaught of bullets and cannonballs. He repeatedly sent messengers to the Northwest Bay, hoping to ease tensions, but was ruthlessly rejected each time. He knew that the attack on Lion Harbor had greatly angered Paul Gleman, and the relationship between them was irreparable. He also tried to contact the Arcane Society and the Holy See, but these two forces, who had once cooperated with him, were plotting a new war against each other and had no time for him. What offered Giles some comfort was that his eastern neighbor, the Veblen family, who ruled the Paradise Basin, responded to his request and promised to send troops to aid him. In the last war, the Veblen stood with Giles against the royal family, and their relationship had remained close. It was clear that if Giles fell, Veblen would be next. Inside the city of Five Rams, Giles summoned his vassals and informed them that the kingdom's army would soon march south again. A surge of fervor swept through the crowd, and the lords eagerly volunteered for battle. "We drove the Northlings back once, and we can drive them back a second time." Morale was high. The vassals' soaring spirit spurred Giles on. He regained his confidence, even rekindling his previous ambition to overthrow the Alder. He loudly commanded, "Go back and mobilize all the forces within your territories. We will assemble at Fuger." Chapter 764. But to Giles's surprise, while he and his vassals were still assembling their troops, the king's army had already marched south. When his scouts brought news of the royal army's departure from Jingaiao to Wuang City, Giles was greatly shocked. Although it was certain that the royal army would eventually march south, past experience showed that there would be a buffer period between the decision-maker's formal decision and the army's actual action. Giles had even anticipated that he could assemble his army before the kingdom's government and launch a preemptive attack on the royal territory. After the initial shock, the Grand Duke quickly reacted, leading his remaining forces towards Drifle. Giles's astonishment profoundly reflected the difference between the kingdom's new-style army and its traditional army. In past wars, when lords were about to launch a formal military campaign, complete secrecy was rarely achieved. Generally, news of the campaign would spread early, either actively or passively, without the need for spies to painstakingly gather intelligence. One could simply sit in a tavern and countless pieces of information would readily reach his ears. Recruiting soldiers, stockpiling supplies, and all sorts of other miscellaneous tasks can drag on for a month or even several months. When the army finally sets off, it will be followed by a long tail. This tail contains a large number of merchants who specialize in serving the army. Whenever there is war, they swarm like bees to pollen, following the army's every need. Their business is all-encompassing, selling weapons, armor, food and drink, lending money, and handling spoils of war, not just anything directly related to combat, but practically everything from food and drink to basic necessities. There are also prostitutes. Soldiers in war live precarious lives, experiencing immense psychological pressure and often needing a place to vent, making the sex trade serving the army extremely popular. Finally, there are the families of officers and soldiers. Not only officers, but some soldiers also bring their families with them, especially many professional mercenaries who make a living in combat, who often have families to support. High-ranking officers may even bring many servants to tend to their and their families' daily needs. It's easy to imagine the level of such an army in terms of marching speed and information security. The new army established by the Alda Instructorate for Rodney's VIE was completely different. This army had a strict top-down secrecy system. Any unauthorized information was strictly prohibited from being disseminated, and violations of secrecy regulations were severely punished. The army was closed, relatively isolated from society. Entry and exit from military bases were strictly managed. Soldiers typically needed an approval process to leave, including submitting a leave application, stating the reason for leaving, destination, and return time, and obtaining approval from superiors. Restrictions were less stringent for senior officers, but complete entry and exit records were still required. Outsiders entering the base needed to register, be accompanied by insiders, and were prohibited from approaching key areas. The army's supplies were handled by the relevant logistics departments. In addition to direct purchases from the market, long-term supply contracts were signed with certain merchants. These merchants were subject to strict qualification checks. In short, merchants could not be allowed to gather in droves around the army base indiscriminately. Despite widespread speculation that the king intended to take action against Giles, the kingdom's army marched south without a sound before its official departure. The day before departure, all participating soldiers had assembled in their camps, packed their belongings, and rested quietly overnight. The next morning, the entire army lined up on the parade ground. Upon the official command, each unit marched out of the camp in turn, one after another, embarking on the road south. Unlike traditional armies, there were no families or merchants following the march. Suspicious individuals were detained. Because there were no large numbers of people unrelated to the battle, and because of their uniform training, the soldiers' physical condition was relatively even, greatly increasing the marching speed. Of course, the movement of tens of thousands of people could not be done silently. Giles received news of the royal army's departure from Jingaeo, but because communication takes time, by the time he received the news, the royal army had already covered half the distance. When Giles hastily led his army halfway through their advance, the royal army had already reached Thornhoit. Further south lay Giles's territory. In the last war, this very fortress had initially withstood the attack of the Grand Duke of Greed. Commander Duke Dodge, with the support of Klein and Leicester, had held the fortress with difficulty. The main royal army then advanced south, pushing the battle line back into Giles's territory. However, after a series of battles with mixed results, the exhausted royal army was forced to retreat, leaving the entire southern region to Giles. Now, Alder would begin to reclaim its glory from Thornhoit. This time, the royal army was commanded by Harrison Abbott, an ambitious young general who, of course, would not remain stationary, politely awaiting Giles's arrival. He ordered the army to continue south, entering Giles's southern territory. The smaller territories along the way, ruled by lords of villages or towns, were utterly powerless against the royal army and had no time to appeal to higher-ranking lords for help. They wisely chose to surrender. The royal army advanced south, even reaching the Fuhrer Wilderness, the site of the previous decisive battle against the rebels, while Giles' main force still hadn't arrived. As they continued their advance, they finally encountered their first slightly tougher obstacle. Earl Zek, Lord of the Firewood, was a loyal vassal of Giles. He had previously received orders from Five Rams to assemble an army for Giles's immediate command. However, he never expected that after only a few days of preparation, the royal army would be approaching his territory. After a brief moment of panic, the Earl regained his composure. He withdrew all 2,000 soldiers to the Firewood Fortress within his territory, determined to hold it and resist fiercely, delaying the northern army's advance and buying time for Giles to gather more troops in the rear. Earl Zek sternly rejected the royal army's attempts to persuade him to surrender, and Harrison then ordered an attack on the fortress. Firewood Fortress was a well-equipped and strategically located military stronghold. In the past, even a mere 2,000 soldiers inside could have inflicted heavy losses on any attacker. However, Count Zek's soldiers had never witnessed the sophisticated development of gunpowder weaponry, and most of them were farmers working in the fields just days before. Harrison lined up the cannons and bombarded the walls relentlessly. Although few of the defenders huddled behind the ramparts were killed, the spewing flames, dense smoke, and whistling shells terrified them. After several rounds of artillery fire, royal soldiers armed with pistols scaled the walls using ladders. At close range, they were almost always successful. Zek's soldiers had never seen such weapons and did not know how to dodge. Even without the ability to fire in rapid succession, and with no time to reload, the soldiers had to switch to melee weapons after each shot. However, faced with an overwhelming barrage of bullets, and once most realized their lethality, the morale of the fortress defenders plummeted. The battle was short-lived, and the kingdom's army captured the fortress. Chapter 765. After the vanguard stormed the walls, they engaged the defenders in hand-to-hand combat with short-barreled rifles and bayonets. The fighting was not fierce, and the already weak-willed defenders of Firewood Fortress quickly collapsed under the onslaught. Royal soldiers captured the fortress gates, removed the obstacles and heavy bolts, and opened the gates. The main force outside poured in and completely occupied the fortress. After clearing the battlefield, Harrison discovered that the enemy's highest commander in the area, Earl Zeke, was nowhere to be found. After a raid and interrogation of the prisoners, some confessed that Earl Zeke had escaped through the fortress's secret passages. Although it was a crushing defeat, the royal army still suffered some casualties. Harrison decided to allow his troops to rest for a few days and wait for the logging supply train. On the path leading south, the defeated Earl Zeke was galloping desperately on a fast horse, accompanied only by two trusted squires. His troops and his family had all become prisoners of the royal army. Look! That's the Grand Duke's banner. He's already reached Phantom Wing Fortress. A squire pointed ahead with his whip, and a green banner with a gold trim, bearing a wolf's head, fluttered on the distant city wall. Excellent. Count Zeke, somewhat disheveled from fleeing and rushing, regained some of his composure. Prince Giles's speed was much faster than he had anticipated. Perhaps his army would soon help him reclaim firewood. Galloping to the city gate, Zeke suddenly hesitated. How should he tell the Grand Duke about the defeat? Losing was one thing, but losing so quickly? The guards at the gate recognized Zeke and let him in without question. Deeply troubled, he slowed his horse and hesitantly rode to the local lord's residence, now the residence of the Grand Duke of Greed. The count requested an audience with his lord from his guards. Bang! The bronze scepter of the Grand Duke of Greed slammed onto the stone steps, the dull thud startling the ravens roosting outside the hall. Count Zeke knelt on the wool rug embroidered with thorns, cold sweat trickling down his temples and into his collar. He had tried his best to embellish his defeat. The royal army's attack had been so swift, and he had been so caught off guard, yet he had still put up a resolute resistance. If it were anyone else, they might have been moved by Zeke's bravery, but Giles was not swayed by his rhetoric. A few direct and incisive questions later, he had essentially pieced together the truth of the battle from the flustered Zeke. Almighty Father, Giles cried out incredulously, his anger barely concealed. Firewood Fortress, such a formidable castle, and you let it fall into the hands of the Yankees after only 3 hours of resistance. Giles's roar shook the stained glass windows. He waved his arms, cursing Zeke, his deep purple velvet cloak billowing with each swing, revealing a ruby-inlaid scimitar at his waist. Several times his hand touched the hilt, making Zeke's heart pound. Firewood Fortress fell even faster than my cook could burn a quail. Faced with the wrath of the Grand Duke of Greed, the surrounding servants silently shrank into the shadows of the pillars. At this moment, another of Giles's men, Sir Samar, suddenly laughed. He was peeling an apple with a silver dagger, the peel curling up and falling beside him. I heard that the Royal Army's cannons have barely been set up when someone was already studying the thickness of the spider webs in the secret passages. His tone was casual, and his voice wasn't loud, but it was sharper than a dagger in his hand, piercing Earl Zeke's ear. Zeke jerked his head up, his dusty face appearing exceptionally pale in the sunlight. You're still here making sarcastic remarks. Just wait until you experience their muskets and cannons for yourselves. Oh, come on, our dear Lord Zeke. Historically, Firewood Fortress withstood the bombardment of dozens of catapults and ballistae without a scratch. Wendell, another of Giles's right-hand men, suddenly interjected, his iron gauntlet tapping against the sword at his waist with a metallic clang. Wendell often served as an envoy for Giles among various powers, not usually known for his martial prowess, but he was actually a highly skilled swordsman. This time, accompanying Giles to the battlefield, he was also equipped with a sturdy suit of armor. Alright, I admit, those cannons were more impressive in appearance than in power, but the more crucial thing is the Royal Army's soldiers. Enough. Grand Duke Giles suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Zeke's sweat-soaked collar, his jade-encrusted ring pressing a red mark against Zeke's Adam's apple. Do you know how far the Royal Army is from us now? 100 li. 100 li. Because he had hastily brought his army, he didn't have many troops at his disposal. He had originally expected to have more time to wait for his vassals to arrive and join him, but now everything was ruined. With each word he spoke, he pushed Zeke back an inch until the back of Zeke's head hit the wall. And you came back like a scolded stray dog, tail between your legs, with the fortress key still tucked in. You came to see me just to make excuses for your defeat. Samar whistled, the apple core he'd just finished eating landing precisely in the fireplace, sparks illuminating his eyes. Perhaps the Royal Army stuffed their cannons with cheese? After all, our Lord Zeke has a dairy allergy. He paused deliberately, admiring Zeke's instantly clenched fist. After the cheese shells came, Lord Zeke had to withdraw from the battle due to severe discomfort. Wendell laughed along, the sound like a dull knife scraping against a rusty shield. Zeke broke free of the Grand Duke's grip, now furious and ashamed. Yes, I was defeated. I wanted to buy you more time to regroup your troops, but I'm sorry I failed. I'm willing to accept any punishment the Grand Duke may impose on me. He stared at Giles, his gaze now devoid of the fear and shame he had shown moments before. Your Highness Giles, please announce your decision regarding me. The Grand Duke stood with his back to the broken stained glass window, the crimson afterglow casting a long shadow that completely enveloped Zeke. Take him to the dungeon." Unlike his earlier rage, his voice was now calm. Two guards approached Zeke, one saying, "Please, Earl." Zeke glanced resentfully at Giles, but the Grand Duke remained silent. "Very well, Your Highness, please allow me to make a humble request. My family has been captured by the kingdom's army, and I beg you to release them." "I will," Giles agreed. Zeke straightened his back, head held high, and followed the two guards out. Chapter 766 Musketeers vs. Longbows. Giles waited anxiously for several days at Phantom Wing Fortress, constantly sending scouts north to investigate the movements of the Royal Army. Based on the various reports, it seemed the Royal Army was resting in the firewood, and Giles breathed a temporary sigh of relief. The vassals who had received his warnings led their troops, arriving intermittently at Phantom Wing Fortress to join Giles. Their arrival was hasty, and the number of soldiers they brought was not ideal, but Giles had finally gathered an army of over 20,000, which he felt was sufficient for a battle. At this moment, the scouts returned to report that the Royal Army had continued its southward advance. Giles immediately led his troops out of Phantom Wing Fortress to meet them head-on. He decided to crush the Royal Army in open battle, securing a decisive victory to completely turn the tide of the war. The reason he didn't hold out in Phantom Wing Fortress was that it wasn't the only route south, and his own 20,000 troops would be unable to maneuver effectively within the fortress. Giles hoped to defeat the enemy quickly, rather than slowly wearing them down. The two armies, marching towards each other, finally met in an open field and immediately engaged in battle. Giles devised a strategy: first, use ragtag troops to probe and weaken the enemy, then unleash the elite undead army to deliver a decisive blow. Under his command, a large number of soldiers began a chaotic charge towards the Royal Army's front. These soldiers were mostly brought by vassals from various regions, their equipment varied widely, and their combat capabilities uneven. The Royal cannons roared, first with solid shot from a distance, then with volleyballs at close range. The rebel soldiers, bombarded by the artillery barrage, suffered a severe blow to their morale and quickly retreated. Giles, enraged, ordered his detachments to push the soldiers forward. After several assaults, the Royal artillery barrels were hot from the fire, with only a few still firing. The rebels finally closed in on the Royal Army, and hand-to-hand combat ensued. The kingdom's army consisted of 6 infantry regiments, each comprised of 1 musketeer battalion and 2 pikemen battalions. While the pikemen engaged the rebels, the musketeers provided support from nearby, prioritizing valuable targets such as armored knights. They often served as both combatants and commanders. Under relentless fire, rebel knights fell one after another, causing their supporting rebel soldiers to scatter. Giles noticed the Royal Musketeers and immediately dispatched longbowmen to suppress them. Longbowmen were second only to the undead in Giles's ranks, and after witnessing the power of firearms in the Northwest Bay, Giles placed even greater emphasis on this ranged force, expecting them to counter the musketeers on the battlefield. These warriors wore chains over their shoulders, leather straps and patches protecting their wrists, protective leather sheaths at their knuckles, short swords and leather pouches hanging from their belts, and were clad in armor. They were highly trained archers, capable of firing 3 to 6 arrows per minute with pinpoint accuracy against distant enemies. Their longbows, crafted from yew wood over 3 years of meticulous work, were equipped with specially designed arrows capable of piercing chainmail. If the arrows were well made, they could even penetrate armor, causing even greater casualties. Through his telescope, Harrison had already spotted the rebel longbowmen gathering and ordered his musketeers to assemble and intercept the approaching archers. A fierce battle ensued between the ranged units. The leaden clouds hung low, seemingly within reach. Martin, a musketeer from the 3rd Battalion of the 2nd Regiment, caught the scent of gunpowder and damp, grassy grass in the air. He instinctively touched the powder flask tucked into his belt to confirm it was still there. To his left, Tom, also from the 3rd Battalion of the 2nd Regiment, was trembling as he attached a match cord to a serpentine pole. The saltpeter-soaked rope emitted a pungent odor. 300 yards, the company commander's shout came from not far away. Martin saw on the distant slope that the rebel longbowmen were drawing their terrifying arrows from their quivers, sunlight occasionally piercing through the clouds, reflecting a cold glint on the arrowheads. The first volley of arrows came faster than expected, and Martin heard a chilling whistling sound overhead, like death sharpening its scythe. He instinctively crouched down, an arrow grazing his helmet and embedding itself in the dirt behind him, its fletching still trembling violently. Load, The company commander's shout had become hoarse from issuing orders. Martin quickly poured gunpowder into the barrel, followed by lead bullets in tag. His fingers were clumsy with tension. This was, after all, the new army's first tough battle. Some gunpowder spilled onto the damp ground. To his right, another young soldier had finished loading and was aiming with trembling hands. The second volley of longbowmen followed immediately. This time, Martin heard a scream. An arrow had pierced Tom's shoulder blade, and he staggered to the ground, his musket falling to the floor. Martin saw Tom's blood soaking the grass beneath him, the unlit match still smoldering. "Fire!" the company commander shouted. Ignoring his worry for Tom, Martin took a deep breath, pulled the trigger, and brought the match close to the powder vat. A deafening roar followed, the recoil slamming into his shoulder. Choking white smoke obscured his vision, like white flowers blooming in the air. Martin vaguely saw several bursts of blood erupt in the distant longbowmen's ranks, their figures falling backward. Reload, fire, dot. Several volleys followed, and the Royal Army's musketeers also endured several volleys of arrows, suffering heavy casualties. Harrison immediately ordered men to be drawn from the reserves to fill the gaps in the musketeer ranks, picking up the weapons and ammunition of the wounded and resuming fire. Although the Royal Infantry consisted of musketeers and pikemen, the pikemen had also received firearms training. They were familiar with every step, and operating a musket was not as complex as operating a cannon, making training much cheaper. The two sides continued exchanging fire, and the tide of battle seemed to be turning. The well-trained longbowmen had clearly underestimated the rate of fire and power of the muskets, and what shocked them even more was that no matter how many enemy soldiers they killed, someone could always be brought in to replace them. Giles was both astonished and frightened. Could anyone really operate a weapon that sprayed flames and smoke? His own longbowmen were losing one by one, because archery required extensive training. And his ordinary infantry couldn't simply pick up a longbow and replace the previous archer like the enemy could. The rebel longbowmen's formation began to crumble, and the rain of arrows became sparse. Free fire, a new order was given, and Martin heard explosions rising and falling, white smoke almost forming a cloud above the position. The enemy longbowman commander was shouting something at the top of his lungs, but it was quickly interrupted by a gunshot. Martin saw the figure in the magnificent armor fall from his horse. Only when the last longbowman turned to flee did Martin realize his matchlock had burned to the end. The battlefield reeked of gunpowder and blood, and the bodies of soldiers from both sides lay scattered on the ground. Martin trembled as he removed his helmet, a deep arrow wound marked it. He was incredibly lucky to be alive. He looked up at the fleeing enemy longbowmen in the distance and couldn't help but cheer with his comrades. Chapter 767. After a fierce battle, the Royal Army achieved a decisive victory over the rebel forces of Grand Duke Reed. Statistics from the battlefield cleanup showed that the Royal Army had killed over 2,000 enemy soldiers and captured over 3,000, while suffering over 2,000 casualties themselves. The loss ratio seemed relatively even, but since this was the new army's first experience with such a tough battle, Commander Harrison was generally satisfied. He compiled a detailed battle report and sent it at breakneck speed to Crystal Radiance. Upon reaching Thorn Fortress, the messenger first sent a brief message via telegraph, then mounted his horse and continued northward with a full report. The telegraph system had been extended from Crystal Radiance to Thorn Fortress, the southernmost point of the royal domain. As a follower of many things in the Northwest Bay, how could Rodney's VI overlook such a fast means of information transmission as the telegraph? After Princess Irene, who had run away from home, returned to Crystal Radiance, she described the wonders of the telegraph to Rodney's VI, who was still alive at the time. This piqued the old king's interest, and with his approval, Eileen oversaw the construction of a telegraph node route leading north, connecting Crystal Radiance with Lake Town. What used to take half a month by fast horse to send a message from Crystal Radiance to Lake Town now only took half a day. Undoubtedly, the telegraph was a powerful tool, strengthening the connections between Crystal Radiance and its vassals across the lands, a prospect welcomed by Rodney's VI. Since his ascension to the throne, the expansion of the royal telegraph system had been a continuous effort, with communication routes radiating outwards from Crystal Radiance. Had it not been for numerous objections, Rodney's VI would have even wanted to install signal stations in every city. As the driving force and decision-maker behind this southern campaign, Rodney's VI closely monitored the movements of the kingdom's army. The king's office was filled with the scent of cedar and parchment, and sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting dappled shadows on the massive sand table in the center of the room. The sand table occupied the entire oak table, meticulously depicting the mountains and rivers of the southern border of the Kingdom of Alder. A silver-plated castle model stood at the location of the capital, while black soldier models representing the rebels were scattered across the hills and mountains of the south. The king's fingers unconsciously tapped the edge of the sand table, his gaze never leaving the red-painted soldier models. This was General Harrison's Southern Expeditionary Army, stationed in the firewood. What's going on? Why haven't we received any new messages? Rodney's VIE suddenly complained, his eyes fixed on the models on the sand table. They haven't moved in a long time. Just then, hurried footsteps came from the corridor outside. The king recognized the rhythm of these footsteps. It was his master of ceremonies, Wayne. Anything that could make him so urgent must be news from the front. Rodney's VIE felt a mixture of excitement and worry. Hopefully, it wasn't bad news. Your Majesty, the telegraph station just received a message from General Harrison. Wayne practically rushed into the office, just as the king had expected. Our army clashed with Giles 50 miles north of Phantom Wing Fortress and emerged victorious. We suffered 2,381 casualties, killed 2,450 enemies, and captured 3,260. Giles has fled towards Rainbow Fortress. Wayne finished reading the note in his hand, slightly out of breath. God bless us. This is a great victory, the king shouted, completely absorbed in the joy of victory. The attendant on duty, William, tiptoed to the sand table and began moving the red and black soldier models. Under his control, the red models representing the Royal Army occupied Phantom Wing Fortress, while the black models representing the rebels were moved to the road leading to Rainbow Fortress. Yes, that's it. Rodney's VIE laughed heartily, looking at the sand table as if he were witnessing the Royal Army marching triumphantly south while Giles retreated in disarray. For Giles's current army size, the loss of 5,000 men was considerable. Through reconnaissance, the Royal Army believed that Grand Duke Greedy Wolf had led his army in a southward escape. Sadly, Harrison couldn't witness the pathetic retreat of his opponent. Grand Duke Giles's cloak had long lost its former splendor. The deep purple velvet was torn to shreds by thorns and stained with mud and blood. His mount, a white warhorse that had won countless accolades in tournaments, now limped along the muddy path, one foreleg limping. A commotion suddenly arose at the rear of the column. Giles turned to see several soldiers scrambling for a piece of rations. An officer tried to maintain order, but his voice was hoarse and barely audible. The commotion attracted more and more soldiers, the noise startling crows in the woods, their black plumage glaringly bright in the twilight. To do this right in front of me. They have no respect for me, Giles roared, pointing his whip at the commotion. Zygmunt, tie them all up. Give each of them 30 lashes. Yes, your highness, Giles's captain of the guard responded, spurring his horse to the rear. Giles's gaze fell upon the roadside, where several civilian corpses lay, arrows still lodged in their backs. The kingdom's army hadn't yet reached this point. It was clearly the work of his troops. My lord, the fort is just ahead, Baron Samar reported, riding up to Giles. His brocade coat was covered in dust, and his once meticulously styled hair was now disheveled and plastered to his forehead. Cross the river quickly, then seize all the boats upstream and downstream, and destroy them all. It's speculated that Giles's army still retains considerable strength, and his vassals will continue to supply him with soldiers. We just received news that he has stopped in Raleigh Woods, inside Phantom Wing Keep. Harrison convened the Army's high command to discuss the next phase of the battle plan, including advisors to the Arda Army. Claude looked at the map and offered his opinion. The terrain becomes increasingly complex further south. Giles might use his familiarity with the terrain to evade our pursuit, or even lure us into a trap. We must finish him off here, or at least give him another good beating. Harrison nodded in agreement. I agree with Lord Claude's point. We can't let him escape any longer. Claude pointed to a spot on the map. Perhaps we can detach a portion of our forces and outflank Giles from here, blocking his retreat. Chapter 768 Flanking Maneuvers. Although the Southern Territory is currently under Giles' control, it has long been part of the Kingdom of Alder. Before Giles' rebellion and annexation of the Southern Territory, it was inhabited by many lords loyal to the royal family. During this southern expedition, many former Southern Territory natives served as guides for the kingdom's army, so its basic geography was not unfamiliar to them. On the other hand, As an important part of supporting the kingdom's government, Alder had sent a large number of surveyors disguised as merchants, adventurers, and travelers to the south to survey the geography and draw many professional maps. These maps were far more accurate than traditional maps drawn based on the cartographer's intuition, becoming an important basis for the kingdom's army to formulate marching and battle plans. Now, the Alder royal army has pursued Giles into a mountainous region known as the Devil's Belly. Its terrain resembles folds squeezed into the earth. Although the mountains of the Southern Territory are not as majestic as the Rocky Mountains that stretch across the north, they are still rugged and difficult to traverse. Roads capable of supporting a sizable army are few and far between. Inside the command post, Claude, the advisor to Elda, pointed at the map and presented his flanking maneuver strategy to Harrison, the commander of the Royal Army. It's clear that Giles intends to hold Eagle's Beak Pass in Raleigh Woods. We are confident we can capture it, but a frontal assault alone won't stop his continued southward escape. Looking at the map, there's a mountain road to the east that bypasses Eagle's Beak Pass. Using this route, we can outflank the pass from the rear, cutting off southern support for Giles and preventing his further southward flight. Claude's suggestion was essentially a flanking maneuver. As Giles was unlikely to have multiple defenses, it was almost certain his forces would be concentrated at Eagle's Beak Pass. Bypassing it would suffice. Harrison looked at the guide beside him. Is the road Lord Claude mentioned feasible? The guide frowned and thought for a moment before replying. That path does exist. Many merchants use it to bypass checkpoints and smuggle goods. However, it's extremely difficult to traverse, and I'm not sure if it can support a sizable army. There are hardly any towns or even villages along the way, so we can't guarantee timely access to food and water. How many days would it take to reach the rear of Eagle's Beak Pass, if all goes smoothly? About 5 days. Harrison looked at Claude and said confidently, that shouldn't be a problem. Our soldiers can carry their own rations and walk. 5 days shouldn't be an issue. Claude nodded. It's best to travel light. Don't bring too many weapons or ammunition. Harrison looked around at the officers. Does anyone have any other opinions? Someone raised their hand. I think. After a detailed discussion, the Royal Army's High Command reached a consensus on dividing their forces to block Giles's retreat, and the staff began working on the details of the operation. The Kingdom's army's flanking maneuver will face numerous challenges, the most difficult being the coordination between the two separated forces. Lacking reliable long-range communication, they can only agree on the timing of each stage of the operation. As this is the first time implementing a flanking maneuver, only one time point has been set. The arrival of the flanking force at the target location and the launch of the main force's attack. Upon arrival at the agreed time, the main force will launch a frontal attack on Eagle's Beak Pass, regardless of whether the flanking force has reached its designated position. If the flanking force is still en route and the frontal attack is successful, then Giles will escape. Unless forced into a corner, the greedy Grand Duke is unlikely to be willing to perish with a pass. Furthermore, the Kingdom's army may also suffer the terrible consequence of insufficient frontal attack strength due to the division of forces, allowing Giles to launch a counterattack. The troops that have penetrated behind enemy lines will face an extremely perilous predicament. They will effectively be surrounded. However, isn't war a gamble? Of the 6 infantry regiments heading south, the 2nd Royal Infantry Regiment has been selected to carry out the flanking maneuver. At the meeting, all 6 regimental commanders requested Harrison to entrust the mission to their respective units. They were all young, passionate, competitive, and adventurous, eager to achieve glory and bring honor to their families. Naturally, they would also secretly compete in this war against the rebels, fearing to fall behind. Viscount Ed Chambers, commander of the 2nd Regiment, was extremely excited and swore to Harrison that he would arrive at the destination behind Eagle's Beak Pass on time, promising to kick the great traitor Giles's ass hard. After the staff revised the plan, each soldier of the Royal Army's 2nd Infantry Regiment, carrying 5 days' rations, and accompanied by local guides, ventured into the folds of the Devil's Belly. Their food included hard bread, dried meat, fried noodles, canned goods, and other long-lasting options. Fried noodles and canned goods from the Northwest Bay were particularly popular. Since the invention of canned goods, the manufacturing process had undergone numerous upgrades, with packaging changing from earthenware jars to glass, and the shelf life extended to a year. Although they were traveling along rarely traveled paths, they still had to proceed with extreme caution, as no one could guarantee that Giles had not set up checkpoints along these routes. Regimental Commander Chambers, fully aware of the weight of his responsibility, dared not slacken in the slightest, strictly adhering to the infantry manual's instructions, sending scouts forward, backward, left, and right during the march to constantly monitor the surrounding area. However, good fortune did not always favor the kingdom's army. As the 2nd Regiment struggled through the mountain valleys, a sudden downpour drastically increased their difficulties. The muddy ground made the mountain paths even more treacherous, and there was also the danger of mudslides and landslides. The 2nd Regiment had to stretch its ranks further, passing through dangerous sections one company at a time. Some soldiers fell ill from the rain, but fortunately, the kingdom's new army, with its ample nutrition and training, generally had excellent physical condition, preventing a large-scale outbreak of disease. Chambers established a group specifically to care for and recover the soldiers who had fallen behind due to illness, while the main force continued its advance. But an even greater difficulty lies in the fact that some sections of the route have been altered by heavy rains, changing the landscape. While this might be a minor adjustment for nature, for tiny humans, a small obstruction in a valley forces them to take a long detour, or even worse, there's no path at all, forcing them to carve it out themselves. Even with local guides, this presents significant challenges. This is where the kingdom's new army truly tests its field combat skills. If they stray off course anywhere, they won't be able to reach the rear of Eagle's Beak Pass on schedule. Sorry, I've been quite busy this week. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 769 Successful Detour. Since retreating to Eagle's Beak Pass, Giles had been reorganizing his army there. He constantly wrote letters to his various vassal territories, urging the local lords to continue providing him with new soldiers. He also wrote to Veblen, located to the east of his territory, questioning why his army was so late in arriving. Initially, he was relieved that the royal army seemed to have paused to rest again, meaning the attack he faced might not be so urgent. During this time, under the personal supervision of Grand Duke Greed, Eagle's Beak Pass was fortified from top to bottom. Large numbers of civilians from the surrounding area were conscripted as laborers to continuously transport building materials such as stone and timber to Eagle's Beak Pass. The original walls were raised by 3 meters, and numerous defensive structures and weapon traps were built. Finally, the royal army arrived. They set up camp not far from Eagle's Beak Pass. To Giles's surprise, the royal army did not immediately launch an attack, but merely blocked the exit of the pass. However, as the days passed, suspicion grew throughout Giles's army. A few days later, rain suddenly fell. Giles felt his opportunity had arrived. According to his intelligence, Aldous Firearms performed poorly in rainy or damp conditions. Once the rain subsided, he ordered his troops out of Eagle's Beak Pass, preparing for a major battle with the kingdom's army. The kingdom's army did not back down and immediately sent troops to meet them. Giles's prediction was correct. The weather did indeed affect the kingdom's firearms, but the rigorously trained kingdom army was not entirely reliant on firearms. On the open ground before Eagle's Beak Pass, the 2 armies' pikemen stood in neat formation, facing each other like a steel forest. A few rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds, illuminating the cold tips of their spears, which gleamed with a blinding light. As the war drums sounded, both sides shouted in unison, their voices deafening. The 2 thickets of spears approached each other in the drizzle, then suddenly stopped, before thrusting forward again. The spear tips clashed, producing a piercing metallic clang. The front-line soldiers gripped their spears tightly, thrusting fiercely, while the rear advanced relentlessly, forming a continuous offensive. Blood splattered, armor shattered, and fallen figures were quickly replaced by newcomers. The air was thick with a stench of blood and dust, a cacophony of shouts and screams. Giles had deployed his undead army. These soldiers, under the influence of drugs, their facial muscles contorted in a grotesque grimace, their eyes blazing with bloodlust, their expressions terrifying. They fought while shouting and taunting the opposing royal soldiers with all sorts of filthy and vile language. The royal soldiers, however, remained resolute, their steps steady, calmly responding to the insults, not one deserting or retreating, only obeying orders to advance or retreat. Every step taken by both sides was a matter of life and death. The battlefield was a meat grinder, mercilessly devouring lives. After a long and fierce battle, Giles realized that his army had gained no advantage and had no choice but to order a hasty retreat back to the pass. The kingdom's army, having already begun its flanking maneuver, didn't pursue relentlessly, fearing they might force Giles to retreat prematurely. Damn it, Giles slammed his helmet to the ground. He was back in his command post at Eagle's Beak Pass, raging. What did that brat Rodney's VIE feed his soldiers? He suspected the kingdom's soldiers, like his undead army, had been given some strange concoction. Our losses are heavy, we desperately need reinforcements. Hasn't the new batch of soldiers arrived yet? Giles, his eyes bloodshot, demanded angrily of his right-hand men, Wendell and Samar. The two men exchanged a glance, both noticing each other's wariness. These two had recently undergone a complex psychological process. Initially, they were very confident in their army, so when Count Zik fled in disarray, they both looked down on him. But after personally fighting alongside their lord against the kingdom's army in several battles, their initial arrogance vanished, and they began to realize the dire reality they faced. The kingdom's soldiers were several times stronger than in the last war. Seeing his lord's gaze fixed on him, Samar shuddered and had no choice but to say, "Oh." Nelson, who's in charge of recruitment, went to Frog Collar Town to receive the troops early. He should be back by now. Perhaps we should send someone to urge him again. Wendell frowned. Nelson is a heavy drinker. Could he have gotten himself drunk again at the town's tavern? Giles lashed out with a whip he was still holding. Send someone to Frog Collar Town. If he's really drunk and causing trouble, skin him alive and hang him in the town center. The Grand Duke's furious roar shook the house. Grand Duke Giles's orders regarding Nelson were now impossible to carry out. He had become a prisoner of the kingdom's army. Frog Collar Town was nestled in a mountain valley south of Eagle's Beak Pass, a crucial passage from the pass to the further south. Because of its strategic location, it was a bustling place with many merchants passing through. However, due to the recent war, many young men in the town had been conscripted by Giles for forced labor. Those who remained dared not leave their homes, fearing they would be drafted if they wandered the streets. The town felt desolate and bleak. One morning, residents who went out to gather firewood encountered something unusual. A large contingent of people had descended from the nearby mountains. Armed and dressed in uniform, they were clearly an army. Though travel-worn and their clothes filthy, each soldier seemed to possess a powerful spirit, heads held high, chests out, marching in orderly, resounding steps as they slowly entered the town. This was the 2nd Royal Infantry Regiment, which had circled through the mountains to reach the rear of Eagle's Beak Pass. Having overcome numerous hardships, they had finally emerged from the folds of the Devil's Belly, and, on the right track, arrived at their planned destination in time. When they looked down upon Frogtown from the mountains, every member of the 2nd Regiment cheered spontaneously. After his initial excitement, Commander Ed Chambers calmly dispatched scouts to stealthily approach the town. Once he confirmed there were no Giles troops stationed there, he ordered his soldiers to straighten up, form impeccable ranks, and enter the town with an imposing presence. For the kingdom to secure its rule over the south, the army's first impression on the locals was crucial. Chapter 770. Due to the war, business at the Frogquall Town Tavern was rather slow. Today, only a handful of customers were drinking, and young people were few and far between. After all, with a certain special guest present, young people coming here would be like lambs to the slaughter. Nelson was this special guest. As a subordinate of Duke Giles, he had recently been assigned a rather important task, recruiting soldiers. Especially given the heavy losses in recent battles, Nelson's work was particularly crucial. His purpose in coming to Frogquall Town wasn't to recruit the local residents, as the blood taxes paid by the lords of the Southern Territory were due. His purpose was to receive these new recruits. However, if he saw any strong young men he fancied along the way, he wouldn't mind taking them in as well. Mr. Nelson wouldn't let his work interfere with his enjoyment. Early in the morning, he kicked open the door of the Frogquall Town Tavern and ordered the owner to pour him a large glass of every kind of liquor. He was waiting for someone anyway, so what was wrong with savoring some fine wine while waiting? Besides, due to the long journey, the recruits might be delayed by a day or two. He had his servants stand guard at the door, watching the entrance, while he went inside and started drinking, getting himself completely drunk. "Oh boss, another, 5 more of this," Nelson mumbled, his hand trembling as he pointed to the 3rd glass in the row of glasses. The tavern owner asked cautiously and ingratiatingly, 5 cups of dragonfire? Yes, hiccup. 5 cups of dragonfire, bang! Just as he was about to start the second round, a loud crash rang out, and the servant outside rushed in, his face filled with panic. Lord Nils, an army has entered town. But they're acting strangely. What? An army? A bleary-eyed Nils hiccuped. Oh, it's the Grand Duke's new blood. What's so strange about that? Remembering his work, he greeted the tavern owner. I've got some work to do. Don't clear the table yet. Come back and continue drinking when you're done, finding out which territory they came from, counting their numbers, and arranging a place for the soldiers to rest wouldn't take too long. His attendant was getting impatient. My lord, they don't look like they were from our side. Indeed, the soldiers sent from the various vassal states before were all a mess in terms of equipment and clothing, many carrying pitchforks and hoes, gathered together noisily. But this army, the attendant had never seen soldiers dressed so uniformly and in such orderly formation. He had been busy with logistics work with Nelson and had never seen the kingdom's army in battle. Nelson shoved the servants in annoyance. Ignorant fool. If they're not on our side, are they the enemies? Eagle's Beak Pass hasn't fallen yet. How could the enemy be in our rear? Be careful, the Grand Duke hears this and has you hanged. He put on his hat, rubbed his eyes, which were blurry from drunkenness, and tried to make them bright again. He struck a rather imposing pose and swaggered out. Sure enough, an army was marching towards the town center. Ed Chambers, commander of the 2nd Royal Infantry Regiment, walked alongside his troops. While traversing the mountains and valleys of the Devil's Belly, the regiment's horses had all been lost, and the officers and soldiers had to walk. Something unexpected happened. The townspeople avoided them like the plague. Except for a man who had just emerged from a tavern, swaying unsteadily towards them. This man was chubby, wearing light armor, and his legs seemed unable to support his weight, causing him to wobble like a bull as he walked. Even from several meters away, Chambers could smell the alcohol wafting on the breeze. It seemed he'd encountered a drunkard. Hiccup. Nelson's bravado didn't last long. He reverted to his previous drunken state and asked, "Who's the leader?" No one answered. "Who's the leader?" Nelson asked again. Still no response. Annoyed, Nelson puffed out his chest and shouted, "How rude. I am Lord Nelson, the recruiting officer sent here by Grand Duke Giles. You newly arrived soldiers all have to obey me. Answer my question." Giles' men. Chambers, expressionless, ordered, "Take him down." 2 soldiers grabbed Nelson's thick arms from either side and shoved him to the ground with a thud. "Damn, that hurts. Are you trying to rebel?" Still drunk, Nelson's face was flushed red with alcohol and anger. He shouted, "Which lord sent you?" "I'll report your treason to the Grand Council." His squire, however, realized what was happening, but it was too late to run. He surrendered obediently. "You're the ones rebelling." Chambers stepped forward and slapped Nelson twice across the face. "Listen, we are the glorious 2nd Royal Alder Infantry Regiment. We're here to suppress you traitors. Your royalty." Nelson jolted awake, finally sobering up. "That's impossible. Has Eagle's Beak Pass already fallen?" In his mind, it was impossible for a large army to bypass Eagle's Beak Pass via the rugged mountain paths. Never mind that, just go to jail. It wasn't just Nelson and his entourage who were taken prisoner. A squad of 50 rebel soldiers stationed in the town were also captured. These guys spent their days idly in town, drinking and gambling in the outpost even when surrounded by the royal army, without even sending anyone to stand guard at the crossroads. Chambers couldn't help but be puzzled by what he saw. In previous battles, he had witnessed many brave warriors in Giles's army, especially those known as the Undead, who were quite troublesome. But he hadn't expected the rebels' second-line troops to be so degenerate and disorganized. Was this the same group that had held off the royal army in the last war? Chambers came from a noble family in Crystal Radiance, received a complete traditional knightly and military education, and had served the royal army many times. For example, he had followed Harrison to suppress the pirates in West Harbor. But he was the kind of knight who came when called upon, arriving with his squire when there was a battle, and returning home when there wasn't. Previously, he had never been assigned to command an army, nor had he spent much time in the old-style army. As a nobleman, he had little interaction with ordinary soldiers. When Rodney's VIE was building the new army, young noblemen like him, who were knowledgeable in military affairs and had little of the old army's habits, were welcomed and appointed to various important positions. Chambers wholeheartedly agreed with a military system and discipline from the Western Bay, believing that this was how an army should be. It wasn't until the southward campaign against Giles that he was truly eye-opened. while the troops directly under the Grand Duke of Greed were somewhat commendable. The armed forces of those local lords could hardly be called an army. Chapter 771. Upon entering Frog Collar Town, the 2nd Royal Infantry Regiment immediately began preparations for defense. Chambers ordered his men to guard all the town's entrances and exits, and sent men to invite the townspeople to an open area in the town center, identifying themselves to them. The townspeople were shocked. The royal army had actually reached this place. They looked at each other in disbelief. "Sir, how is Giles?" the gray-haired mayor, leaning on his cane, cautiously asked Chambers. "The rebel Giles is still putting up a stubborn resistance at Eagle's Beak Pass. We've come here to surround him and prevent his escape south." Chambers didn't hide his purpose. In fact, he even planned to spread the news soon to quickly demoralize the rebels and create widespread panic. "Gentlemen," he said, "I am about to issue a series of orders. These orders may not seem friendly to you now, but as a soldier of the Kingdom of Waldo, I assure you that your losses will be reasonably compensated, and we will not directly involve you in the battle." Anxiety spread among the townspeople, but in truth, everyone was already somewhat prepared. In fact, this mental preparation had been in place since the outbreak of war. Centuries of war between lords had taught the common people many survival skills: obey whoever comes, and don't risk your lives to fight. Chambers conscripted all the able-bodied men in the town, collected all the building materials, including bricks, stones, and timber, and demolished several vacant buildings. He ordered all the soldiers and residents to build fortifications on a selected high ground next to Frog Collar Town. A wooden watchtower, originally used for defense against bandits, stood atop the high ground, the highest point in the town, and adjacent to the main road leading north from Frog Collar Town. The soldiers, wielding shovels and picks requisitioned from the town, worked the terrain of the high ground, carving out a rough vertical surface from the surrounding slopes. The townspeople then laid bricks on top. After a day's work, a makeshift fortress took shape, consisting of 2 levels. The upper level housed ranged units such as muskets, cannons, and crossbows, while pikemen were stationed behind the breastwork of the lower level. Because they had come from across mountains, the 2nd Regiment could not carry heavy artillery, only a 3-pounder cannon. This was a light artillery piece specially designed by Arda to support infantry in rugged terrain, nicknamed Grasshopper. The barrel was about 120 centimeters long and weighed about 94 kilograms, allowing for rapid movement with just 1 horse or 4 soldiers. Although a light artillery piece, it still possessed formidable power, capable of inflicting effective damage at a range of 600 meters. Its solid shot could easily penetrate breastworks made of sand and gravel. For this flanking maneuver, the 2nd Regiment brought a total of 10 Grasshopper light artillery pieces. Due to previous encounters with bad weather and the lack of time to dry them during the march, the gunpowder carried by the kingdom's army was severely damp. Now, having arrived at Frog Town, they finally had the time and place. In the town's threshing ground, the townspeople watched curiously as the kingdom's artillerymen spread out buckets of black powder, dried it for half a day, and then hurriedly collected it back. Many locals speculated that the black powder might be some kind of medicine. After a busy day, as sunset approached, soldiers on guard outside the town reported that a troop was approaching from the south, roughly estimated to be over 2,000 men. Chambers deduced that this troop was the reinforcements that the rebel recruiter, Nelson, wanted to receive. He made a bold decision, ordering 2 soldiers to watch Nelson make contact and lure the rebel reinforcements into the town's main street. The cowardly Nils obediently followed orders. Chambers' plan was a complete success. The reinforcements, encountering their own people, had no suspicion whatsoever and recklessly dragged their long, serpentine column into the town. But soon, a large number of figures emerged from the rooftops and alleyways, aiming their muskets and crossbows at the stunned rebel reinforcements in the street. With Nilsson giving instructions, the Royal Army quickly located the rebel commander beside him. A series of cracking sounds followed, and the unfortunate man collapsed to the ground, blood splattering everywhere, without uttering a sound. Most of the rebel reinforcements were newly conscripted laborers, hastily trained for a few days before being sent to the battlefield. They had no effective organization whatsoever, and upon seeing their commander dead, they immediately panicked and rushed to surrender to the Royal Army. Chambers accepted their surrender. During interrogation, he discovered that many of them had received combat training and were equipped with weapons such as swords and spears. He decided to expand his forces. All the officers were taken into custody, while the soldiers were dispersed and assigned to various battalions. Chambers judged that without officers in command, these surrendered soldiers wouldn't harbor any resentment. At most, they might try to escape in the chaos. The next morning, the kingdom's army, encamped opposite Eagle's Beak Pass, finally launched a fierce attack as planned. The booming of cannons echoed repeatedly through the valley, and shell after shell pounded the formidable walls of Eagle's Beak Pass. At this critical moment, Giles's messenger returned, urging Nelson to return. "Your Highness," the bruised and battered subordinate cried out upon seeing Giles, "Frogtown has been taken by the Yankees." Everyone present was stunned. "How is that possible?" Giles grabbed his collar angrily, almost lifting him up. "Could they fly over there?" "I don't know," the subordinate cried. "I only saw the Royal Army soldiers on the street when I entered the town, and I knew something was wrong. I tried to run, but they spotted me." His face was swollen, and he slurred his words. Nelson was among them too. "He probably surrendered. That bastard revealed my identity, and those Yankees beat me to pulp. The Yankee leader told me to go back to Eagle's Beak and tell you to surrender immediately." "Ouch, be gentle, damn it." Giles threw the subordinate to the ground. The surrounding men, including Wendell and Samar, were stunned by this sudden news, frozen in place, speechless. The fall of Frogtown means that their connection with Five Ram City has been severed. Even if they can hold Eagle's Beak Pass for the time being, without reinforcements from the rear, their troops and food will slowly run out, and they will eventually be captured by the kingdom's army. However, if they divide their forces now to retake Frogtown, their defensive strength will be greatly weakened. Chapter 772. With the help of the high and sturdy walls of Eagle's Beak Pass, the kingdom's army's first attack was repelled. However, their attack also inflicted heavy losses on the defenders of the pass, and due to the recent catastrophic event in the rear, Eagle's Beak Pass was now receiving no reinforcements. "Who can think of a solution? Speak up. Have you all become mute?" Seeing his subordinates remain silent, Grand Duke Giles became even more furious. "Listen to me." He paced back and forth, waving his cloak, his boots slamming heavily on the ground, making a loud thud that felt as if a giant hammer was striking their hearts. "We have already suffered a shameful defeat at Phantom Wing Fortress. We must not suffer the same humiliation at Eagle's Beak Pass," Giles shouted. "I swear in the name of the Supreme Ruler of Algnan that I will defeat Rodney's army here." With a clang, he drew his sword. "I will." Just as his men were preparing to hear their lord's inspiring speech, a thunderous roar erupted outside again. The kingdom's army was shelling again. Giles was interrupted by the sudden cannon fire, momentarily deflated, and tried to continue his address, only to find that he had forgotten what he was going to say. He angrily sheathed his sword. "Your Highness," an officer rushed into the room in a panic, but was stopped by the guards at the door, and could only shout from outside. "Let him in." With Giles's permission, the officer entered, panting. "What's the panic? Is the enemy attacking the city again?" Giles shouted at him. There was no attack. But, after the cannon fire, they shot many arrows with paper tied to them onto the pass, with words written on them. The officer stepped forward and presented a crumpled piece of paper. Giles unfolded it and nearly fainted with rage. It stated that Frogtown behind Eagle's Beak Pass had been captured by the kingdom's army, and the soldiers on the pass were surrounded. How despicable. How vicious. He tore the paper to shreds in a few swift movements, glaring with murderous intent, and shouted. What was the reaction of the soldiers on the wall? It must have written something very ominous. Could they be telling the truth? The officer muttered to himself. He couldn't read, but some people on the city wall could, and they had read aloud the contents of the paper in public. Frogtown had fallen, and Eagle's Beak Pass was surrounded. Naturally, the news spread like wildfire, and the soldiers guarding the wall awaiting the kingdom's army's attack immediately erupted in uproar. "Waa town, which is behind us, has already fallen," the officer replied, forcing a smile. "Father," Giles cried out, "use your brains. We're still here. Do you think Scrutter's dogs can fly? Do you think they can fly over this pass and land behind us? Have you seen anything flying in the sky these past few days? That seems to be it." The officer scratched the back of his head. Firstly, he wasn't a local and didn't know there were any passable roads in the nearby mountains. Secondly, even if he knew there were roads, he wouldn't believe a large army could bypass Eagle's Beak Pass through such rugged terrain. This was the Devil's Belly. Grand Duke Giles said solemnly, This is all a Yankees conspiracy, trying to shake our morale with rumors. But I think anyone with a modicum of intelligence wouldn't believe such a ridiculous and lowly claim. Send the order to collect and destroy all these slips of paper. Anyone spreading rumors will be severely punished. Yes, sir." The officer calmed down a bit, bowed, and left. The senior officers inside remained silent. Unlike the soldiers outside who were merely skeptical, they knew the contents were true. The Royal Army wasn't shooting notes, they were shooting nooses, tightening around their necks and making it hard to breathe. "Samar," Giles roared. "Yes, Your Highness." Samar stiffened. Giles frowned and said, "We must recapture Frog Isle Town before the soldiers know the truth. This task is yours, I'll give you." He hesitated, then realized he still didn't know how many royal troops were behind them. Giles was now certain that the Royal Army had circled around to their rear from the nearby mountains, but how many could they possibly outflank? 200, 500, or 1,000? There were only 50 of their own soldiers stationed in Frog Isle Town, so the Royal Army was likely more than that, but probably not too many. As a military commander, he had personally surveyed the terrain deep in the nearby mountains, and based on his own experience, organizing a large-scale march through the folds of the Devil's Belly was extremely difficult. At most, it should be around 1,000 men, right? I'll give you 2,500 soldiers. Recapture Frog Cry Town as soon as possible, although Frog Cry Town, as a town, had no walls. Just to be on the safe side, Giles still managed to spare some troops from the already strained forces at Eagle's Beak Pass and gave them to Samar. But Giles didn't expect that the kingdom's army would send an infantry regiment to outflank him, while a single infantry regiment of the kingdom's new army numbered as many as 3,000 men. Samar accepted the order and quickly set off with his troops. Giles felt he should boost the morale of his army. Under his command, most of the soldiers were concentrated, except for those in key positions. The cliffs of Eagle's Beak Pass were tinged with a reddish hue by the twilight, like blood-stained fangs. Grand Duke Giles stood atop the high tower, the family banners fluttering behind him in the mountain wind. He seemed to feel the stone slabs beneath his feet tremble slightly with the soldiers panting. Many of these followers were wounded, their bandages soaked with blood, their armor dented, yet their eyes still burned with fervor as they looked at him. Giles was generous to those who served him, officers and soldiers alike. It was with their support that the entire southern border of the kingdom was conquered. "Look at the land beneath your feet." He drew his sword sharply, the setting sun casting his shadow on the rock face like a giant spreading his black cloak. "Those bandits from the north want to trample our wheat fields, burn our granaries, steal our sisters, and take every penny of the people of the south." He raised his voice deliberately, his booming voice echoing through the valley. "My loyal and brave warriors, answer me now. Can we allow our homeland to be ravaged by those bandits?" A low, furious roar erupted from the soldiers. "Never, never, never," the voices merged, surging through the valley like a massive wave. Giles nodded, swinging his greatsword. "We will fight to the end, for the South, for the Giles family." An even greater wave surged forth. Chapter 773. After half a day's journey, Samar finally led the army assigned to him by his lord, Giles, to the vicinity of Frog Town. "How's the situation in town?" he asked a man in a black robe beside him, frowning. The man ignored him, staring blankly ahead. "These arrogant wizards," Samar muttered inwardly, recalling how he had worked with spellcasters sent by the Arcane Society during the last war, and they were just as conceited. It seemed that wizards were generally arrogant, regardless of their affiliation. After a while, the wizard finally snapped out of his daze, his eyes darting around. "How's the situation in town?" Samar asked again patiently. The streets are quiet. The watchtower near the entrance seems to have been modified. I saw a high stone wall built there, with spearmen stationed below." "How many?" "Too many obstructions to give a rough estimate, but I saw at least 200, Samar pondered for a moment. 200, not bad, should be too difficult. He didn't believe the kingdom's army could send thousands of soldiers to the rear of Eagle's Beak Pass. While the rebels were observing the situation in the town, the kingdom's army was also observing them. In fact, when the rebels were still marching towards Frog Town, the sentries lying in ambush along the way spotted them and rushed back to report. After the rebels stopped near the town, their figures never left the kingdom's army's binoculars. They've finally arrived. 2nd Regiment Commander Chambers decided to give the enemy a head-on blow. Samar drew his sword and roared at his soldiers, "Lions of the South! Those despicable northerners have sent spies into our rear. They've instigated a small group of bandits to wreak havoc, and now they've infiltrated Frog Collar Town, plundering and oppressing the innocent townspeople. I've brought you here to eliminate them. In the name of Duke Giles, let us charge in, destroy them, crush them, and liberate the townspeople. Charge! 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 Inspired by Samar, the soldiers brandished their weapons and shields, shouting, "On my command, first capture that high ground at the town entrance. Charge!" Samar pointed his sword, and the rebel soldiers eagerly rushed towards the town. They were initially met with a sparse hail of arrows, but the rebel soldiers charged forward, shields raised, and the arrows caused them little damage. However, as they advanced to the vicinity of the high ground, the situation changed. Not only did the arrows become increasingly dense, but even more terrifyingly, a row of royal soldiers armed with muskets suddenly rose from behind the upper stone wall of the high ground. Fire! At the command of the royal officer, white smoke billowed and the sound of gunfire erupted. Several rebels were immediately felled by bullets. How could the bandits of the southern border possess muskets? Having already clashed with the royal army several times, the rebel soldiers brought by Samar recognized muskets and were immediately puzzled. Attack! Attack! Seeing the offensive stall, Samar immediately spurred his horse forward, risking being hit by stray bullets to personally urge his soldiers to attack. The rebel soldiers obeyed Samar's orders, brandishing their weapons and approaching the high ground, engaging in fierce combat with the spearmen stationed behind the lower breastwork. Boom! 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 The grasshopper light cannons opened fire, spraying deadly shrapnel onto the swarming rebel soldiers below. Even a light 3-pounder cannon is still artillery, instantly felling a large number of rebel soldiers and even creating a large gap in the ranks. Boom! With cannon fire from another direction, the rebels suffered heavy losses again. It turned out that there was a church not far from the high ground, and dark cannon muzzles were also protruding from the windows of the second floor. The artillery commander of the 2nd Regiment divided the cannons into 2 groups, with 7 grasshopper cannons placed on the high ground and the other 3 on the nearby church. In this way, when the rebel soldiers stormed into the town and passed by the high ground, the 2 groups of cannons could form a terrible crossfire, striking the rebels from 2 directions. Lead-gray smoke billowed above the rebels' heads, like a curtain of death being drawn, while the royal soldiers were hidden in the thick smoke, appearing and disappearing intermittently. Damn, they actually brought cannons with them. Samar was horrified and quickly tumbled off his horse. It would be bad if you were too conspicuous and became the target of concentrated artillery fire from the royal army. Royal soldiers, holding their spears, stood firm against the rebels behind the lower breastwork. Samar knew the power of the rebels' firearms. Several of Giles's generals had been killed by concentrated artillery fire. Below, spearmen fought the rebels hand to hand, while above, firearms rained down from all directions. Under this relentless barrage, the rebels quickly crumbled, like a tide crashing onto the beach only to recede in another wave. A bunch of useless trash, Samar roared, whipping the retreating soldiers. I should have found an executioner to behead you all. Undeterred, he reorganized the attack, but still made little progress. The soldiers were terrified of the flamethrowers. This repeated several times, Samar still couldn't capture Frog Town, and his army suffered heavy casualties. Even the slow-witted lower-ranking soldiers finally realized something was wrong. The enemies fighting them weren't bandits at all, judging from their clothing and weapons, they were clearly the kingdom's army. Panic instantly spread through the rebels. Just as Samar was at his wit's end, a deafening battle cry suddenly erupted from all around. He immediately looked around and saw massive numbers of figures charging towards them. The already demoralized rebel soldiers were stunned by this sudden attack and collapsed in disarray. Anyone who could move took off running for their life, hoping to escape as quickly as possible. After confirming that the rebel offensive had been thwarted and that they had suffered heavy losses, Chambers decisively unleashed all his forces, decisively defeating Samar and his army, who were planning to retake Frog Town. You actually lost. Giles's eyes widened in disbelief. The news Samar brought back had been a devastating blow. They have at least 5,000 men, the wounded Samar cried. The soldiers I brought earlier were outnumbered. He didn't actually know the exact number, but exaggerating made it easier to deflect blame for the defeat. You mean, 5,000 royal soldiers, without anyone noticing, snicked around through the mountains to our rear? How is that possible? How is that possible? The Grand Duke slammed his fist on the table in fury. Chapter 774 Escape. A military operation involving over 2,000 men suffered a crushing defeat, a fact that could not be concealed, at least not in Giles's army. After Samar led his defeated troops back in disgrace, rumors began to circulate that very night. Many outrageous claims were made, some saying tens of thousands of northerners had appeared behind Eagle's Beak Pass, others that even 5 Ram City had fallen to the royal army. Do you know? There are many large ships in the Northwest Bay. I'm the son of a fisherman, I've seen their ships with my own eyes. They're enormous, as big as castles when they're in the harbor. Jingaeo can requisition their ships and transport soldiers directly from the sea to the southern coast, or even upstream to 5 Ram City. Many knowledgeable soldiers corroborated the rumors with their information. Giles realized that the current situation was dire. The morale of his troops, which he had painstakingly built up, was rapidly crumbling. He had to take decisive action. As dawn broke once more, the deep blast of bugles echoed through the valley before Eagle's Beak Pass, and the kingdom's army launched a fierce attack. This attack was vastly different from the previous probing assaults. The royal artillery barrage was deafening, its terrifying roar tore through the dawn mist, and crimson tongues of fire spewed from the muzzles as shell after shell pounded into Eagle's Beak Pass. The top crenellations of the city wall shattered layer by layer under the relentless hammering of solid shot, turning into scattered stone chips. The artillerymen, shirtless, quickly repositioned their guns amidst the smoke, deftly cleaning the smoking barrels with washing rods. Artillery officers brandished their swords, closely monitoring the situation on the walls of Eagle's Beak Pass. If a shadow moved, they would order the next round of grape shot. The scorching metallic storm would wipe out any rebel soldiers who dared to peek out from the walls. All signs indicated that the kingdom's army was serious. It was indeed time to get serious. The 2nd Royal Infantry Regiment, which had circled around the mountain road to the rear of Eagle's Beak Pass, was completely at the mercy of fate. They might not even receive any supplies, so the main Royal Army force remaining on the front had to accelerate their breakthrough. Under the intense bombardment, although the walls of Eagle's Beak Pass were largely intact, large sections of the crenellations had already been breached. Long live Walter, Levin, the commander of the 1st Royal Infantry Regiment, drew his silver-inlaid sword and roared at his soldiers who were poised to attack. Attack! As soon as the order was given, the soldiers of the 1st Regiment split into several columns, carrying ladders and rushing towards the walls. Each column had a standard-bearer carrying the older royal banner, the flag bearing the royal symbol fluttering in the mountain wind. The enemy is charging. Prepare for battle, Father in heaven, protect us. The rebels on the city walls felt like they were in hell. The night officer on duty, Eumison, felt utterly pathetic. He could have handed over his duties soon and gone back to his barracks for a good night's sleep, but now the Yankees had launched their attack. Suddenly, something whistled past him. Eumison turned in shock to find his squire's face half sliced off, blood soaking his white clothes. Eumison's heart sank. The royal army's new weapon was so malevolent, it gave no chance to defend or fight back. A hit meant certain death or serious injury. Where is His Highness the Duke? Where is Lord Samar? Where is Lord Wendell? Eumison was filled with questions. He had sent messengers to inform them of the attack as soon as it began, so why hadn't the high-ranking officials, including Duke Giles, come to the walls to command? Nobody's here. Nobody's here, the soldier he had sent to deliver the message returned, his face filled with grief and despair. Mason demanded in a shrill voice, "What do you mean?" The soldier screamed madly, "They've all run away. Giles, Samar, Wendell, and all those other big shots, we've vanished. We've been abandoned." His words were like a bombshell, stunning all the soldiers on the city wall. We've been abandoned. Upon hearing this heartbreaking news, the soldiers scattered like headless flies. Some knelt on the ground praying, some wept over the corpses of their comrades, and others frantically tore at their blood-soaked clothes. Mason staggered forward a few steps, his vision blurring, the only sounds the roar of cannons and the groans of the dying echoing in his ears. Giles had run away, with his loyal followers. When Samar led the remnants back to Eagle's Beak Pass, Giles immediately realized his army was doomed. Continuing to stay at Eagle's Beak Pass, even if they could repel every attack from the royal army, would undoubtedly lead to a slow and depleted supply of troops and resources. However, if they could gather their forces to recapture Froghowl Town, they would have to abandon Eagle's Beak Pass, allowing the main royal army to pass through immediately and then attack from both sides with the Froghowl Town forces. Without the protection of the city walls, Giles had already lost confidence in defeating the royal army in the open. He could only run, but with his army, he would be too conspicuous to escape, leaving him no choice but to abandon his loyal subordinates. At this moment, Giles was traveling through the southern mountains of Devil's Belly with a few trusted men. The royal army knew how to take the back roads, and so did they. While they couldn't command a large army, a few men were more than capable. When a beech branch tore through his hood, Grand Duke Greedy Wolf nearly cried out. He was now extremely nervous. Not long ago, his group had stumbled upon a checkpoint set up nearby by the 2nd Infantry Regiment of the Royal Army, resulting in a fierce battle, though he had narrowly escaped with his life. He gripped the hilt of his sword, wrapped in coarse linen, his only remaining sword, its scabbard long since discarded in the ravine, the salty, metallic taste of blood filling his mouth. Baron Samar suddenly crouched 5 paces ahead, his mud-stained mink cloak sweeping across the fallen leaves. "There are wolves. Be careful," Samar warned. Giles felt his heart pounding in his chest, his sweat-soaked linen shirt clung to his back like a cold shroud. Wendell's hand pressed silently on his shoulder. He had been wounded in the recent battle, his left hand missing 3 fingers. But his words of comfort were ineffective. Hearing the distant, mournful howls of wolves, Giles suddenly realized he was trembling, shaking like a farmer shivering in the dead of winter. He had never been so wretched in his life. He stared intently at a puddle at his feet, its surface reflecting his face smeared with coal ash. The scabbed arrow wound on his right cheek, his short, gray-white curls, and his bloodshot eyes that, until last night, had been adorned with a gold-rimmed monocle. Chapter 775. They lay silently in the bushes, their breathing barely audible, afraid to make a sound. When the mournful howls of wolves finally faded into the distance, Samar pulled out a tin can and handed it to Giles. Giles took it and greedily gulped down the water inside, the liquid trickling down his cracked lips and into his collar, leaving dark stains on his clothes. Wendell whispered, "We should still be 30 miles from safety," Samar asked. "Safety? Are you sure it's safe? What if the Yankees get ahead of us?" Wendell removed his glasses and wiped the fog from the lenses with his clothes. "Of course, that's assuming the Royal Guard's hounds haven't blocked the pass, otherwise, we'll have to take a long detour." His words dampened the spirits of the group. Just as Samar was about to speak, Grand Duke Giles suddenly covered his mouth. Danger was imminent again. The mountain wind carried intermittent sounds. The nearest noise was less than 100 paces from the crevice where they were hiding. Samar felt the calluses on the Grand Duke's palms, honed from years of sword fighting, chafe his lips raw, the taste of blood mingling with the earth filling his mouth. He saw the deadly prey ahead, a massive, black-spotted tiger sniffing the ground. The climate of the Southern Territory was ideal for vegetation, providing abundant food for herbivores, who in turn fed a large number of carnivores, extending the food chain step by step. Therefore, the forest ecosystem was incredibly diverse, with wolves, jackals, and large predators being commonplace. Normally, Giles would be delighted to see such a massive tiger, as he was surrounded by a large retinue of squires, armed with various weapons of all lengths. Such a large beast would add another exciting chapter to his hunting record. His favorite tactic was to have his men surround the prey, letting it struggle against the encirclement, gradually tightening the net to reduce its space. The fearful and helpless expression of prey, and their eventual surrender, was one of the most cherished sources of spiritual nourishment for His Highness, the Grand Duke of Greed. But now, Giles only felt fear. He and 3 others were alone, facing a large beast like the black-spotted mountain tiger, a near-certain death sentence. One wrong move and they would become its prey. 5 people. Enough for the beast to eat for a month. "Father, protect us." Giles usually only uttered this prayer, but now he prayed with utmost sincerity, praying that the legendary Supreme Being would send a miracle. With his rich hunting experience, Giles knew that the black-spotted mountain tiger's sense of smell was terrifyingly keen. At this close range, it could find them more easily than he could find a fragrant roast chicken in the kitchen. It seemed a miracle had truly occurred. The beast, sniffing the ground, gradually moved away. Everyone's hearts began to relax. Giles then realized that his other hand, gripping his sword, was drenched in sweat. Only when there was absolutely no movement nearby did they dare to move further. Giles's deerskin boots were already soaked through, each step feeling like treading on rotting corpses. He suddenly tripped over a tree root and fell into a pile of cold mud. Several men quickly pulled the Grand Duke out of the mud, and Wendell suddenly frantically searched his body, letting out a wounded beast's whimper. "What's wrong? Damn it, my pocket watch fell into the mud. It's a family heirloom. Made by the most skilled watchmaker in 5 Ram City. Let me look for it. Wait for me a moment. Save it, you fool." Giles wrung out his soaked cloak. "Even if you pulled out the royal seal now, you'd only get a few coppers from those stupid mountain folk. My lord, I'm not going to exchange it for money," Giles said coldly. "We won't wait for you. I don't want to stay here a moment longer." He turned and stormed off, the others glancing at Wendell before following him. A wave of sadness gripped Wendell's heart, but he reluctantly followed his companion. Giles, walking ahead, suddenly remembered someone, Paul Gleman. It was strange, he actually hated someone he'd never met. The Grand Duke of Greed felt that his rise and fall were all because of this man, and if he could overcome this hurdle, he would exact revenge 100-fold, 1,000-fold, 10,000-fold. Faced with the overwhelming pressure from a powerful enemy ahead and a dead end with no way to retreat, the defenders of Eagle's Beak Pass quickly surrendered. News of the victory was swiftly relayed back to the capital, Crystal Radiance, and Rodney's VIE was overjoyed. Unable to contain his excitement, he immediately informed his ministers. At their suggestion, the palace would hold a ball to celebrate the victory. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the banquet hall as if it were daytime, and the light from numerous candles refracted through the gilded mirrors, making the diamond metal on Rodney's VIE's chest sparkle brilliantly. The king raised his sapphire-encrusted glass, the champagne bubbles dancing merrily within, like the swirling skirts in the hall. "Cheers to victory," Rodney's VIE's voice echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. Musicians played a soaring melody, nobles raised their glasses, and ladies unfurled their fans like a flurry of colorful butterflies taking flight. A newly forged medal adorned the king's robes, a small gift from the front lines, cast from captured rebel weapons. "I heard Giles fled into the mountains like a stray dog. That villain's come to this." Ministers crowded around the king, gleefully discussing the current state of their sworn enemy, the one who had torn the nation apart. For countless years, the nobles of the glittering palace had gnashed their teeth at the mere mention of Giles, yet they were powerless against him. Suddenly, a commotion arose at the door. Attendants pushed a colossal statue into the hall, a statue of the goddess of victory, also cast from captured rebel weapons. Rodney looked at the statue, his expression turning serious. "A toast to Waldo. A toast to the heroes of the front." The king raised his glass and loudly proclaimed his toast. The musicians immediately began playing the newly composed victory song, and the nobles in the dance hall raised their glasses to the king. As the midnight bells tolled, a grand display of fireworks, a toy from the Northwest Bay, lit the night sky of the capital with vibrant colors, illuminating the path to the distant south. Rodney's VIE stood at the edge of the terrace, his glass reflecting the bursting flames as if he were holding a dancing flame of victory. Behind him, the ball continued, laughter and music weaving a triumphant hymn that lingered beneath the palace dome. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.